with Friedrich, and he's like, oh, if only he would come, and it's like a wish come true to her.
Exactly. It's this secret wish that she has, that he would return back to her life.
Yes, and I also think it's very important because Jo literally craves for company in this chapter, but the thing is, like, she has her mother with her and also her father, but she even says that she wants to try all kinds of love that exist. Like, she isn't really satisfied any longer with only the love of her mother, of her parents, or of her sisters.
The previous chapter called All Alone, there's about how lonely she is and how she longs to find love. And I think she says that her heart is so elastic and that she would like to try what romantic love feels like. And this is such a misunderstood part about Little Women. We have discussed about this before, that people really do not seem to read the book at all when they talk about Jo wanting to be independent or whatever.
Yes, and to be honest, I think, like, even if a woman has a partner, it doesn't make them not independent. Like, I mean, relationships can enrich people, and that is the same with Jo and Friedrich. He enriches her, but she still has her independent side, and they live together in a very beautiful harmony.
Yes, and if Jo would have married Laurie, that's when she would have lost her independence completely.
Because Laurie's demanding at that time, especially because we hadn't matured, were like, you have to take care of me, you are the mother to me, and since that's just what you did, you will take care of me 24 hours a day, and when I'm angry, you will do whatever I want you to, etc. I also think in this chapter, and surprises, she completely forgets to compare Friedrich to Laurie, and I think it's also like a funny thing because she has idealized Laurie very much, but in the end, she stayed true to herself, and she fell in love with Friedrich because he is the right man for her. Laurie at that time was a man. He himself states it in that chapter.
Also, in this chapter, there is a apology from Laurie, which I find very feminist thing for Louisa Mayalcott to write, but like we have discussed in this podcast, and you and I have discussed this in our private discussions, that this is one of those things that is not in the adaptations either, because Laurie is so incredibly idealized. I think the only version where Laurie apologizes to Jo is the BBC series from 1970s, and most people have not even heard from it. So I am very glad that I get to discuss about the chapter surprises with you today, because I think this is completely overlooked chapter.
Yeah, I agree. It really is a wonder. And I also think this chapter is very important also for the growth of Laurie, because like we have seen him evolving and growing and improving, but this is kind of the climax because he not only acknowledges his mistakes to himself and the others chapters, but he also acknowledges it to Jo when he says, I was making a mistake at that time and I'm sorry, because I think it is, like you said, first of all, very feminist to acknowledge it, that he forced her to being something she was not, but it is also very important because I don't think in many adaptations you don't really see his growth, and it's actually very sad. Like on some there is kind of an apology, I guess, but it doesn't really feel right because I mean in the movies he kind of never did anything wrong.
Exactly. Like the proposal scene, it is often romanticized. You don't really see how uncomfortable Jo feels that in the book, the way he's treating her. That's a problem. So his apology in the book makes a lot of sense because Laurie himself realized that it wasn't the right thing to do.
That is true. And I also think it's important that Louisa Mayalcott did have Laurie apologize. It is also an ideal way of showing that men can change and better, and that they have to acknowledge it. Like, I think any other author wouldn't have just glossed over it, but I think it is very important that Louisa Mayalcott didn't gloss over it, and I think it's also important that Louisa Mayalcott did have Joe uncomfortable with Laurie being so possessive of her, because, I mean, who wouldn't feel uncomfortable when their friend would force them to something they didn't want?
Yes, it's kind of interesting because in later chapter, I think it's under the umbrella, Friedrich says that he thinks he knows Joe very well, and that's why he does not force himself to her. Then we have Laurie, who has known Joe since he was 15, and then he tries to force himself on Joe. And you would think that it would be the opposite.
Yes, that is very much true. And I often have to say, I really loved how Friedrich was introduced in New York. And I loved how great his character also is in this chapter, because when he comes to, I think, Orchard House to visit Joe and sees that she's gone, he at first doesn't want to go inside because she's busy and all that stuff. But then he stays because Joe looks at him in such a way, and because she just throws him into the house, kind of like she shawls him into the house, and how like he doesn't change for Joe, like he doesn't pretend he is somebody else who talks to Joe's parents. He is still himself. And I also love that in this chapter he looks at Laurie a great deal, and he also looks at Joe a great deal. And the fact that Joe is like, she has to keep her eyes focused because is afraid that her eyes will look constantly at Friedrich is also very funny.
There's something about him that speaks right to her soul. It reminds me of that part in New York when he's speaking about religion, and then I think in that chapter he really becomes Joe's hero. So there's something similar that happens here.
Like I said, I really love Friedrich as a character. And I also love the fact that Louisa Mayalcott didn't just like gloss over the fact that Friedrich was visiting her. It was a very important chapter, and it also let the audience know Friedrich even better, because he was there for Joe, but he also he wasn't only nice to Joe, he was nice to everybody around her, because that is who he is.
You're pretty well educated when it comes to Louisa Mayalcott. Would you like to tell a little bit how you got introduced to Little Woman and her writings?
It happened like this. I was kind of craving for reading something in English, and I was like, why not try some classic out? And then it was the first time I kind of discovered it, but there are kind of a few bad reviews, so I wasn't really sure, and I couldn't get a reading extract of it. So I thought to myself, let's wait a bit. But then, when I got to the shop to look for some English book, there again it was, and it was like the whole version of it, like I think 777 pages, and I read a bit into it, and I was like, okay, this is the novel I really want to read. So I started reading this one, and I fell in love with her writing, and then I read her other novels as well, and the one that also had a real big impact on me besides that when would also work, because it is such an incredible novel about the women. The funny thing with it is, the biggest to the neck is really how I always imagine my own aunt to be. I have two of them. The older one especially reminded me of her. And
Thank you so much for sharing my love for Little Woman. All the transcriptions of the Little Woman podcast are now available as paperbacks, ebooks, and as audiobooks on Amazon, Kindle, Nook, and bookstores. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
that is really thorough. It's in every novel of her, and then there are people who claim that she didn't love him, but the fact is okay, if she only included Henry David Thoreau kind of character in, for example, Little Women, then maybe we could say, okay, she didn't love him, but it is clear that she was very much in love with him or had a crush on him, because that kind of character is in all of her novels. Meg, David, I wouldn't say Tom in And an old-fashioned girl is completely like him, but when he matures, he also kind of becomes that kind of archetype. And I think it is really important.
Adam in Moods is also based on Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah, right. I really forgot him.
And then there's the German man in the Queen of Hearts. He's based on Henry David Thoreau. So the list goes on and on. At some point, maybe in this podcast, I will go through all of these Henry David Thoreau archetypes. Yes, you are correct. He appears in literal disguises in pretty much every single Louisa May Alcott novel or short story.
Yes, and also in A Fade to Long Love Shades, I think that's what it's called. It's quite a thriller. And I think that one is also very important because in that one, Henry David Thoreau.
Then in Little Man, the narrator says that he has improved his English a lot, but he still uses some of his favorite German phrases like Schatz and mein son, and yeah.
Yes, that is true. I also have to say, I think it is also very important for him to actually use this kind of, like, he has a very vocabulary, I'd say. And I think it is also very important to note that he didn't come to New York for himself. The reason why he came there was to provide for his nephews. And I think it also shows his very caring nature. Thought just came now to my mind. It's also kind of a parallel to Louisa May Alcott when she wants to provide for her own nephews. And I think that was the reason why she even started writing Little Men. She knew she wanted to write another book to the series, but she was like, okay, I have to provide for my nephews because their father just died. And then she wrote Little Men, and that is just so sweet. And it's also a wonderful parallel to how Friedrich came to New York to provide for his nephews, and when he seeks work so he can provide a home for Joe.
That is true. I hadn't thought about that before. That is a parallel between Louisa May Alcott and Friedrich's character. Her brother-in-law, John Pratt, had died before she started to write Little Man.
I also have to say, whenever I read Little Men, I always cry at the passage when John Brooke dies. But again, it is such a great revelation on how caring Friedrich is, because he is very important in the novel Little Men as well. And I just love him even more for that he's so caring and so sweet. And it's kind of funny. I also wrote that to you. It's kind of, it is like normally in picture, these kind of characters, like the one who are very caring, who are very open about their feelings, who work for loved ones, mostly are actually women in these kind of fictions. And I also think it's very important that Friedrich is a male because he kind of unifies men and women in his character.
Yes, he has very empathic nature that is often considered to be more feminine.
Yes, that's true. But I think for me, I'm not in the age right now, but if there was somebody I'd like to marry or somebody I would fall in love with, that would probably be somebody who's empathetic, who loves me, who respects me. It's of such importance for a person to be empathetic because then the world can evolve with people like that.
And that was such a big deal for Louisa May Alcott. She found it very important that people did feel sympathy to others, especially those in bad situations, because she came from such a poor background herself.
Definitely. And I also think it's very important that unlike many fans who actually wanted Joe and Laurie to be together, I think it is perfect that she made Joe and Friedrich an official couple, because in part 1, they are the Hummels, they are German, and besides that, I think Joe is the one who cares for them the most. And like I said, they're German, they are poor, and that is the same how Friedrich is. He's so very important that a novel at that time portrayed the German culture, German language, etc. as a very good and new thing, because mostly when I now look at movies or something like that, it is mostly propaganda that all Germans are bad, and I think that is a very sad thing because, everybody has a good and a bad side inside him or herself, and I think it should be balanced. And I really love that, unlike most people of her time, Louisa Mayalcott didn't treat German people with disrespect, but with very much respect, especially because she was a transcendentalist, and transcendentalism is very much inspired by German philosophy that was also stated by Friedrich in the 1994 adaptation. And I also think it's very important to acknowledge the fact that, unlike most people of the time, Louisa Mayalcott did love Germany and German people, because diversity is very important and respect is very important.
Yes, I think you are actually the person who might be able to tell about this. Louisa Mayalcott loved Goethe, and Goethe is really a big part of German culture in general. How do you see Goethe in Germany? What's his presence?
We've read a few poems of his. My father has, I think, both in Turkish, but still toast, has a copy of it. And I have to say, just newly in the German class, we discussed a poem of Goethe's when he looked at Schiller's skull, because these two were very close. When he looked at Schiller's skull, that's when he wrote the poem. And I have to say, I think Goethe is very important, because he portrays such a positive aspect of German culture. I also have to say, I think it's sad that the teenagers of this time, which I used to be, but I'm not longer right now, I think it's also very sad. Many people in my classes, they dislike poems in general, so they also kind of dislike Goethe's poems, and then I am there. I adore his poems, because first of all, his language is very wonderful for me, and I also have to say, I have a fable for interesting people, so I guess I'll someday even read all of Goethe's novels, or when I find a good biography, I'll also plan on reading one, because I also think that it's very important to know about people who shaped our culture.
What you said about Schiller made me wonder if Schiller was the one who Friedrich was named after in Little Woman, or maybe it was Friedrich Dalmat Fouquet. But I have a feeling it might have been Schiller.
Yeah, me too. Especially because I think that Goethe and Schiller, they are very close. Like I said, he wrote a poem after seeing a skull. I think because they were very good friends, and Louisa Mayalcott was such, not a fanatic, but she really, really loved Goethe. That was very clear. I mean, even in work, David, he has novels of Schiller as well as of Goethe. So I think it is more likely that Friedrich is named after Schiller. Yes, that's of course my own theory. But like I said, I also think that besides Goethe, I think Schiller also may have had an impact on Louisa, because in The Robbers, I think it's called, in Schiller's first novel, there's a feminine character called Amalia. I don't know how to pronounce her in English, but she is very sweet, very generous. She is kind of like Beth, but without the fact that Beth fell in love with somebody. She's very kind and giving and generous, and she only wants the best for everyone. So I also had some parallels between Schiller's work and Louisa's work.
That's really interesting. What was the name of that book?
It was called The Robbers. Like I said, it's the first novel, so I haven't read anything else to him yet, but maybe in another novel of this, we also see how much he's in, because we wrote that the one when he was 17. Suppose he was not allowed to write at that time. I forgot why, but he wasn't allowed. And I think it's funny that he made a story that is close to Louisa Mayalcott's Blood and Thunder stories, and the main character, Cole, is very much an archetype of the movement that was around in Germany at that time.
I was just saying that in Rose in Blue, Mac reads Goethe, but I realized he doesn't read Goethe, he actually reads Henry David Thoreau. In Little Woman, there's a moment in part 1 where John translates a poem from Schiller to Meg.
That is very cute, and it's also very funny because John also knows German, and it's also funny if you think about it. It's kind of like the whole March family is very interested in German culture. Like maybe you don't see much with the others as much as you see with Joe, but I think Meg was also very eager to hear the translation of it, and John was also like, "Yeah, I'll help you translate it, or I can teach you with German." I think he said that. I'm not sure, but I think he said that, and it was also very sweet.
Yes, I have forgotten about that. I love it. It kind of goes along with my theory that Louisa Mayalcott planned Joe's marriage maybe years before she wrote Little Woman, because it does feel like a natural thing to do to introduce a German character to this family that is really obsessed about everything that comes from Germany.
I have to say, the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear like people saying Friedrich was on a shovel because Louisa was forced to marry Joe off is, well, but why, if she was forced, why in the world would Louisa Mayalcott write so many things about Joe's and the wife's love for Germany?
I think we can all agree that this really comes from that the quote that she wrote in her journal was about reuniting with her loved one in the afterlife. So Little Woman is a wish fulfillment.
Yes, that's true. And I also have to say, when like people read it, I think it's also kind of racist of them to state that he was shoveled into the novel, because I mean they know Friedrich is German, and it's almost always he's like they dislike him, especially because he is German. Like even people today are like, meh, she should have stayed single or with Laurie, which, to be honest, I can't stand both of it. I could never stand the thought that Joe might have ended with Laurie or alone, especially after reading the chapters All Alone and Surprises, because in these two chapters you can see how lonely Joe is, and then there are people who say she only married Friedrich because Friedrich was invented because Louisa Mayalcott was forced to marry him.
I think you're correct about the racism, because I have read so many Louisa Mayalcott studies that are like, Joe should have married Laurie or Joe should have been alone. There usually is a racist undertone when they start to speak about Friedrich's character, and then they do not include this part in Little Woman where Joe clearly loves everything that comes from Germany, or Louisa Mayalcott's adoration to Germany. In Rose in Bloom, there is a Chinese character called Fancy, and he marries an American girl.
And I also think it's funny that in Rose in Bloom, I think married, it is also very important because it shows that, well, okay, he was kind of mocked a bit, Fancy, in the first book. I think it is also very important because, like, she didn't just completely leave them off in the second book. She included them, Fancy, and she made him marry an American because it shows how inclusive she is. And while I know that many people are like, well, yes, but Louisa Mayalcott has something against the Irish, while I can read a bit of it in her novels, we don't know what happened to her that made her hate the Irish people so much, and whether it's true at all.
I think it was a comment at the time to mock the Irish people, unfortunately. I spoke with someone who was working the Orchard House, and they said that it was really more about the effect of the time period. I don't know. Yeah, Irish people don't really get a good reputation in Little Woman because when Amy's limes are thrown to the snow, they are the Irish girls who are picking on her. We don't know.
But it's also kind of funny because Hannah herself is Irish, and Hannah is portrayed in a good light. So I agree with you. I think it is more like the effects of the time, because I mean, if Louisa Mayalcott included a Chinese and Asian character in one of her novels, had this person marry an American, and it was portrayed as a good thing, then why should she be completely against the Irish if, like, Hannah was portrayed in such a good light?
I think it's a bit the same, like, now there's war going on in Ukraine, and Finnish here are boycotting Russian products, but I don't think all Finnish hate Russians because of that, because it's not all Russians who are there. or who are the cause of the situation, but it's certain individuals. I think we are onto something here. And the Marches themselves are Irish descendants, so I think it's a lot more complex. I think it's the same with the Italians, because on one hand, we have Louisa Mayalcott, who really sort of shows what she considered good qualities of Italians and maybe the less good qualities. But there was lots of hate against Italians at the time period. So it's quite remarkable that Laurie is half Italian in the book. And Germans were also really disliked during this time period in America, in certain circles.
I also think it's very important, like, Mr. Lawrence is actually portrayed, like, he's a very kind and giving and lovable person, but he also has a flaw that part one, we learned that his son-in-law or married an Italian woman, and she was against it. Mrs. March states that he never could like the Italian lady, even though she was very kind and loving and overall a very nice person. And Mr. Lawrence couldn't like her, even though she was very kind to him and all that stuff, simply because he kind of represented, I think, the culture or the society around that time.
If Mr. Lawrence was raised in an environment where there is a lot of preconceptions against Italians, then he would part of that kind of generation that sort of automatically sees them as lower than he. It sucks, but that's the way a lot of people are, even still today.
Yes, sadly, but I also did say, I really love how Louisa Mayalcott, she made these interracial marriages and that women work so well. Whenever I read those passages between the couples, like except for Meg and John, they are both American. They're still a lovely couple though. But whenever I read it, I love the way Louisa Mayalcott portrays these couples, Amy and Laurie, and Joe and Friedrich, because it really gets lost in all of the adaptations. I think the only couple which gets a bit of light, where we get to see a bit, it is the one between John and Meg, only because Meg is the first one to marry, I assume. But then movie makers all like romanticize Joe and Laurie, and it doesn't feel right, because it also kind of cheapens the fact that she does in the end fall in love with Friedrich and never love with Laurie the way people expected her to.
Because that's not the way things happen in the novel. And because Laurie is based partially on Laddie Wisniewski. And the more I have read about Louisa Mayalcott's relationship with Laddie Wisniewski, it more and more feels like as a mother and son relationship.
I see what you mean. I also have to state that for me, I don't think that Little Women would have been, I will call it perfect, because nothing or nobody is perfect, but it would have not been the masterpiece, as I call it, if Joe had ended up with Laurie, because first of all, Louisa Mayalcott based all the characters around somebody she loved, cared about, you, and it would not have been right for her to marry Joe and Laurie, because Ladislaw is the inspiration for Laurie, one of the inspirations, and she doesn't end up with Laurie. I don't think it will work, because it is all like it. I know it's only semi-autobiographical, but it would not have felt right, because in the proposal scene, which I rather call the harassing scene, but in that one, you see in the novel, of course, only because why would the movie makers do such a wonderful thing? They very much don't show that in the novel, Joe really talks to him in that scene as if he were a child. It really comes off. She's like, you will meet an accomplished woman, you sensible boy, and all that stuff. That is really there, and the movie makers just don't use it. Okay, the movie makers, for me, are more likely to be after the money because Little Women is such a beloved tale. But that's another thing.
I agree. And we will get into this chapter soon. Throughout after this chapter, Joe refers Laurie and Amy as children.
Yes, that is also very cute and funny, and it also shows that Joe has always been much more mature than Laurie. I can't kind of say whether she was more mature than Aim after Aim grew up. But I think it also shows that while Jo is a free spirit and independent and I will not say egoistic, but at some kinds it calls, she says like, I only want to do things for myself. So she cares very much about herself. And she also respects herself very much. And I love that she calls them the children because first of all, it's cute. Second of all, it, like I said, it shows that she's very much mature.
I think in part 1 of Little Woman, Jo is more egoistic, but so is Amy, and so is Meg and Laurie, because they are teens. Your life pretty much centers around yourself.
Yes, that's true. I also have to say, I really love how Jo evolved in the end, because many people are like, she was such a feminist in the first book, and then in Good Wives, or part 2 as I called it, she's like so not anti-feminist, and she's like very man-loving. That's not the Jo we love and like, blah blah blah. And then I'm just like, I think the toxic masculinity of Jo's shows even in chapter 3 when she goes to Laurie when she's sick, and she's like, why don't you invite somebody so you have company? He's like, well, no, the boys are too loud, etc. And then he's like, well, then why don't you call a girl? Because girls are quiet and they like to play nurse.
I see what you mean.
I get why people would falsely assume that Jo is a feminist in the first part, but that is not the case. She loves men very much, she idealizes them, and she thinks it's a shame to be a woman. And that is the complete opposite of what feminist and feminism is about. Like, I think it's very important that you said it in the later parts when, for example, Laurie harasses her and all that stuff, and later in Jo's point, that she knows to be a feminist because she accepts that having feminine empathy, feminine kind of interests isn't a bad thing. It's more a bad thing to be like, everything female is bad and everything male is wonderful.
Thank you so much for listening. Cinema and I continue our discussion on the next episode. Take care and make good choices.
Yeah, I definitely get that feeling that it's probably the one version I feel like is the closest that kind of sense, like you said, that they're both the demis and that they're more interested in how their relationship develops than, in any other way emotionally.
I really like that version when it comes to Jo and Friedrich.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by that version, because sometimes modern day versions, it can be difficult in regards to how do they translate certain things that happened back then. Like, how do you still get that same sense of a debutante ball? Like, what would be the modern day equivalent? It's like, oh, well, be smart about it. It doesn't exactly have to be the same essence. You just need a big party. What's a big party? Prom. But they managed to do very well by a lot of the things in the story, in the sort of canon verse that Jo cuts her hair to get money for her father. And it's like, well, how do you still get that same feeling? She cuts it to support Beth, who gets, I think it's like leukemia in that version.
Yeah.
So you still get that same sense of like, oh, she cut her hair for a noble cause. But in this case, the noble cause is for Beth. So it still has that same feeling of what Jo does. I know that some people kind of get upset. Like, I saw someone get upset that it wasn't the ice skating, but that it was a horse wet. You need to almost get herself get seriously harmed. And I'm like, what? Well, first of all, I don't think that really was that bad of a change, honestly. And it makes sense because nowadays there isn't a lot of those sort of open lakes for people to go ice skating. There's more ice skating rinks available for the public. Whereas with if you're riding a horse, there is the danger of if you go a little too fast, the horse suddenly stops when you're supposed to jump over a thing and you fall off. I think that's a very fair way of translating it. But I didn't know. I went into it with low expectations because I didn't want to get my hopes up. And I walked out being like, this is top 3, I'll say, of favorite adaptations, honestly.
So people can really tell
how much demisexuals we are, because it's so absurd to us when people are complaining about the actors' looks.
Yeah.
Well, I posted some of the clips of the 2018 film to my YouTube channel, and people were just saying how gorgeous Ian Bohen is. I'm not saying he's not gorgeous, but can we talk about something else, like their relationship? Hopefully, maybe this helps people to understand what a demisexual is. Yeah, Ian Bohen is very handsome, but
Yeah.
there's so much more in that movie. Same with Son of Brass in the 1949 film. Like, people just say, oh, he's gorgeous. Can we talk about his and Joe's relationship in this movie? That's why I posted these clips.
Can we talk about the fact that he pretty much is like, I think you are an amazing writer and I support you. You go, girl. Like, yeah, behind that pretty face, there's a... honestly, I say Friedrich is a feminist icon, honestly. Like, he would definitely be that guy that is just like, that's my wife, like, you know, and be 100% proud. It took Laurie to sort of, I think, time to get to that point, but like Friedrich right off the bat is like, women are awesome and I love them. But yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Like, you know, everyone's like, oh, you know, Lewis Carroll is, you know, probably the handsomest Friedrich. I'm like, okay, fine, but is he going to be a good Friedrich? And I think he was probably the highlight of that film. I think he himself is a good actor, but like, we can talk about whether or not, like, is the relationship between Joe and Friedrich actually good or not? Why does it matter? Or like when people say like, oh, why that guy? He looks way too old, or he's not as attractive. It's like, hey, did you see that moment when like he just said, I have nothing to give but a full heart and empty hand? Like, how, like, oh my God, guys, when you see people talk about like, oh, I love those like angsty romance heroes who love someone, but they want them to be happy, like almost like a Colonel Brandon type. I'm like, here's Friedrich right there. Like, he doesn't think that he is deserving of Joe, but he supports her. And when he gets to Concord and he feels like there's maybe hope, he's got a picture of Joe and he kisses her because he's like, I'm so happy to see you again. And I think there might be a chance, like, oh, you know? Right. But no, people want to talk about, is he attractive or not? And it's like, the point here, well, way over.
Somebody posted on Twitter that scene where in the 2017 series he comes and he has that poem with him. I'm like, this is my favorite scene in this whole series. And then there were people commenting, well, he's not attractive. I don't care. I've been thinking about this a lot, or the whole asexual conversation. I think coming from the fact that I guess people should know that in the Victorian times, sex was entirely censored. Because when I was reading these studies, and we didn't throw it to my podcast, he actually censored words like bedroom and bathroom and all the names of his love interest from his diaries. Sometimes you can see how he changed word devotion and worship to great admiration, and Louisa Mayalcottismypassion did the same. Some of the things might be lost when we don't pay attention to the historical context. And I think you can see that in Little Woman, because in the chapter All Alone, there's this a scene where the narrator says that don't because a lot of because a lot of them hide tragic romances behind humble gowns, something like that. So I was thinking, talking about where lovers or this wish fulfillment that we have been discussing here. I read quite a few people saying that, oh, I'm like Joe. I don't want to get married. I just want to stay at home, be with my family. And I'm like, well, that's not the book, Joe, because she does not want to only stay at home. She feels that she needs to take Bed's place, and she needs to take care of her parents and be this great bird of the home. And then she does that for a couple of days, and she gets bored, and she feels like this is not the life for me. What I really want is to live my own life, have a family, and find somebody. And that's when she gets this letter from Amy, where she writes how happy she is with Laurie. And then she feels really lonely and envies their happiness.
it makes me upset that people misread the book so well. In this case, they probably don't read the book. If we want to understand Little Woman better, we should not ignore these things that happen in the novel.
And it's funny when you said, like, oh, I want to be just like Joe, where I don't get married and I stay home. I'm like, that sounds closer to who Beth is rather than Joe. Like, and yeah, it's amazing how people sort of misinterpret. And I don't want to tell people exactly, like, when people say things like, I see Joe as being trans and wanting to be a boy, I'm like, fine, but like the reasoning you have behind it is that you think Joe acts like a boy because she truly wants to be a boy, and that's not exactly how it goes in the story. It's more of a wanting the freedom that a boy has. And again, as we mentioned earlier about, sort of the internalized misogyny that she has about being a girl. I don't want to be that person that says you're wrong, but on the other hand, like, the reasoning you have behind it is not true to what the story actually portrays these characters to be. It can be loca.
I think it's really sad because, that whole chapter, All Alone, it's really miserable. I don't know anyone who can read that chapter and think that Joe just wants to be at home. I can't really think of anyone who can read, Amy's letter about Laurie and think that Joe envies Amy or Laurie. She envies that sister is happy and married, and then she...
Poet Ezra Pound said that literature does not exist in a vacuum, and semi-biographical novels are exactly that, semi-biographical, a work of fiction strongly influenced by events in an author's life. Writer Janet Manley describes Fridge Bear as a perfect mystery, a perfect crush. He is the perfect text, a space offering up multiple interpretations. In this video I explore Friedrich's historical and cinematic evolution through gender studies, his and Joe's relationship and the development of their romance, and how it correlated with Louisa Mayalcott's own life, Louisa's adoration towards Germany and German culture. I will touch the fan culture as well, and how certain themes that have been repeated in the movies again and again affect to the way people see Joe and Friedrich. The key ingredient in understanding Friedrich's character lies within Louisa Mayalcott's love for Germany, German people, German language, German philosophy, and most importantly, German literature. We might even refer Louisa Mayalcott as a Germanophile, a person who has a great deal of interest towards German culture. Make sure to give a like to this video and subscribe to my channel Small Umbrella in the Rain for in-depth Little Woman content. There are multiple references to Germany in Little Woman. On the very first chapter of Little Woman, Joe wishes a copy of Undine and Sintram as a Christmas present. Undine and Sintram is a collection of Scandinavian and Germanic fables written by a French-German author, Friedrich de la Motte Fouquet. Beth catches the scarlet fever, which is terrible, but the Marches never blamed the Hummels. Epidemic diseases were rather common back then, and Louisa always writes about the Hummels with a great sympathy. In the chapter Camp Lawrence, John Brooke translates a German song for Meg, and reads her parts from Mary Stuart, which is a play that was written by German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller. On Meg's and John's wedding, Laurie suggests that they dance like the Germans do. When Jo stays in New York, her hostess in the boarding house, Mrs. Kirk. Kirk is an anglicized last name for German word Kirche, meaning church. When it comes to the 19th century German culture and the influences of German immigration into American culture, Little Woman's saga is consistently favorable towards it. One of Louisa's favorite authors was the German poet Goethe, and Goethe was one of the models for Friedrich's character. In Little Woman, on her grand tour in Europe with Aunt March, Amy visits Goethe's house and writes home and tells about it. On her first trip to Europe, Louisa herself made a pilgrimage to Goethe's house, went to Wiesbaden first, a pleasant gay place full of people, saw the gambling hall and people playing the fine grounds and drives, and then went to Frankfurt. Here I saw and enjoyed a good deal. The statues of Goethe, Schiller, Faust, Gutenberg and Schaffer in the squares. Goethe's house is a tall, plain building with each story projecting over the lower, and a Dutch roof, a marble slab over the front door, recording the date of Goethe's birth. I took a look at it. and wanted to go in, as it was empty, but there was no time. The most obvious and most important German influence in Little Woman is, of course, the love of Joe's life, Friedrich Bär. Little Woman takes place in the feminine sphere, which is one of the biggest reasons why I and millions of other readers love it. When it comes to the main three male characters, Laurie, Fritz and John, Louisa did not write explicit background stories to any of them. To explore Friedrich's character and to get better understanding of him, we need to explore Louisa, her personal life philosophy, values and of course her love for Germany. Friedrich is introduced quite early on in the second novel, and Jo is curious about him from the moment she sees him, and she finds him to be a kindred spirit. As I went downstairs soon after, I saw something I liked. The flights are very long in this tall house, and as I stood waiting at the head of the third one for a little servant girl to lumber up, I saw a gentleman come along behind her, take her heavy hoard of coal out of her hand, carry it all the way up, put it down at a door nearby, and walk away, saying with a kind nod and a foreign accent, "It goes better so. The little bag is too young to have such heaviness." Wasn't it good of him? I like such things, for as father says, trifles show character. When I mentioned it to Mrs. K. that evening, she laughed and said, "That must have been Professor Bär. He is always doing things of that sort." Mrs. K. told me he was from Berlin, very learned and good, but poor as a church mouse, and gives lessons to support himself and two little orphan nephews who he is educating here, according to the wishes of his sister, who married an American. Not a very romantic story, but it interests me, and I was glad to hear that Mrs. lends him her parlour for some of his scholars. There's a glass door between it and the nursery, and I meant to peep at him, and then I'll tell you how he looks. He's almost 40, so it's no harm, Marmee. Fritz is about 16 years older than Jo, which would mean that Friedrich is somewhere between 37 and 39 when they meet. There is a reason why Fritz is 16 years older than Jo. Louisa had a professor of her own, and we'll get into that later on. In Little Woman musical, Fritz is slightly younger. When he goes to court Jo, we find out that he has just had his 35th birthday. In the book, Friedrich returns to Jo's life during the springtime, some months after Bet's passing. If we combine the two, we can make an assumption that Fritz was born in the spring. If Fritz is almost 40 after the American Civil War, this means that he was born sometimes between 1825 and 1827. Fritz is very extrovert. He enjoys lively conversations, makes friends easily, sees beyond cultural boundaries. He is deeply religious, honest, cultured, but also quite a romantic. It is not a coincidence that Friedrich is from Berlin. By the time Alcott wrote Little Woman, Berlin was gaining more importance and would become the capital of the new German Empire in 1871. While being born and living in Berlin, Fritz would have absorbed all that the city had to offer: architecture, literature, churches, philosophical circles, symposiums, markets and beer gardens. It is mentioned in the book that Fritz speaks several languages, and in the books he speaks French few times. Berlin was one of the most multicultural German cities in the 19th century, and there was a large French-speaking immigrant population. The fact that Fritz speaks several languages indicates that he has done some traveling and is in that sense as much of a cosmopolitan as Amy and Laurie are. We learn that Friedrich used to be a respected professor in Berlin, and this only increases Jo's interest towards him. Jo valued goodness highly, but she also possessed a most feminine respect for intellect, and a little discovery which she made about the professor added much to her regard for him. He never spoke of himself, and no one ever knew that in his native city he had been a man much honored for learning and integrity, till a countryman came to see him. He never spoke of himself, and in a conversation with Miss Norton divulged the pleasing fact. From her Jo learned it, and liked it all the better because Mr. Bär had never told it. She felt proud to know that he was an honored professor in Berlin, though only a poor language master in America, and his homely, hard-working life was much beautified by the spice of romance which this discovery gave it. It is very likely that Louisa had Humboldt's University in her mind. During the time when Louisa did her first visit to Germany, it was known as the University of Berlin. University was established in 1809, which makes it only fitting that Friedrich would have studied and worked as a professor there. University is known for producing some of the most well-known German thinkers and philosophers. We are not told a lot about Friedrich's family. We find out that he had a sister, Niina, who married an American, and on her deathbed she asked Fritz to take care of his nephews and raise them in America. It is not part of the canon, but I have read a couple fanfics where Mina's husband was an American journalist who abandoned his family, and Niina was also quite possibly a journalist. This would explain why Friedrich does his best to look after the boys, wants to be a good role model and someone who never abandons them. Book does imply that Friedrich and Niina were very close. This is a common narrative pattern in Louisa Mayalcott's novels. In Work Story of Experience, the protagonist's love interest David has lost a connection with his sister. In Moods, the character of Geoffrey Moore takes care of his ill sister until she passes away. Of course, the loss of a sister is something that also bonds Jo and Fritz. In the 19th century, German immigrants were the second biggest group of immigrants in the US, only surpassed by Irish immigrants. March family and the Alcotts in real life were descendants of Irish immigrants. Between 1847 and 1855, German immigrants came to US in large numbers. Many came in the hopes of better way of life, others because of individual curiosity, economic hardships, political struggles, or religious persecutions. Many escaped the crop failure and famine. When we first meet Friedrich, we find out that he has been living in New York for 5 years, which means that he arrived in 1860. In the early 1860s, main transportation across the Atlantic was made with sails, and the trip could last 1 to 3 months. This would mean that Fritz would have arrived with a sailing ship that was designed for a cargo carriage. These ships were quite hazardous, and accommodation were small and dark. The second wave of German immigrants arrived in the end of the 1860s, escaping the German wars. Friedrich's reasons for leaving his home country are family related. There are a couple occasions in Little Woman that do give an impression that Fritz has faced oppression and discrimination, and Jo does make a note to herself that he must have had a hard life. It is not a coincidence that Jo and Friedrich meet in New York of all places. Many of the German immigrants moved into the cities in North, like New York, which already had established German communities. These communities were tight. When Friedrich comes to visit Jo in Concord, the reader finds out that he has German friends there. Louisa very intentionally included messages of social justice to her works. A lot of the details of Friedrich's backstory are not included in the movies and TV adaptations, because of the screenwriter's personal biases, xenophobia, and ignorance over the source material. Yes, this is going to be a video essay about Louisa May Alcott's intersectional feminism. Louisa May Alcott was born into the New England's Transcendentalist movement. Transcendentalism was very much an American movement, but its roots were within German philosophy and Romanticism, especially in the transnational ideas of Immanuel Kant and his new ethic of universal hospitality. There are a couple basic principles within transcendentalist philosophy. Human beings are inherently good and pure. Nature was the ultimate mediator and expression of God, who was present all around. Self-reflection and being true to oneself was encouraged. From a very early age, Louisa practiced self-reflection and observance, and from her novels Little Woman and Old-Fashioned Girl have biggest transcendentalist influences. Little Woman film from 1994 is one of the rare adaptations with clear references to transcendentalism. When Jo meets Fritz, they talk about German philosophy. Jo mentions that her parents were part of a rather unusual circle in Concord, and she mentions that Goethe. Friedrich quotes a poem from another transcendentalist, Walt Whitman, and Jo joins him. Transcendentalists believed that it was through the observation and appreciation of nature that the human soul was enlightened. The idea of being true authentic self becomes part of their conversation. Transcendentalist love for nature can be seen in the movie, in the presence of flowers and plants in the outdoors and indoors. Proposals in the movie and in the book takes place in nature, and it correlates the way in the book Friedrich has Getcho's poem. Be worthy of love and love will come in the falling of summer rain. Louisa Mayalcott was surrounded by the greatest thinkers of her time, Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Father Bronson Alcott showed her an idealistic and ultimately unworkable version of the movement. Throughout Louisa's childhood, Bronson pursued philosophical ideas by establishing the Temple School, where he sought to teach children according to his transcendental ideas. Some of Bronson's ideas were too radical for the parents, and eventually he was forced to resign when he took a black child as a student. Soon after the closing of the Temple School, the family moved to Farmstead to establish a utopian society called Fruitlands. There they attempted to live off the land, follow a strict vegetarian diet, and more fully implement the ideas that Bronson deemed important. Fruitland was a terrible failure. The Alcotts were subjected to back-breaking work, but barely survived the winter. After a little less than a year on the homestead, they left. Although Louisa had seen her father's transcendentalist projects fail, she still believed in the philosophy as much as he did, and blamed the setbacks on poor planning and execution. It was after this that they moved to Concord, where the transcendentalist movement started to take shape. Emerson was a good friend of Bronson, and Louisa frequently borrowed books from Emerson's library and learned about nature from Henry David Thoreau. Margaret Fuller made an everlasting impression on Louisa with her philosophy and feminist ideas. It was unusual for the time for mother to work outside the home, but Abba Alcott did. Bronson had determination to give his daughters proper education, also unusual for the time. Abba had less interest towards the ideological side of transcendentalism, but more in what practical tools transcendentalism offered. Louisa had mixed emotions about transcendentalism. Intrigued and inspired by the ideal of self-reliance, she still knew from first-hand experience that self-reliance really meant reliance on others and required the self-sacrifice of family members. Louisa wanted to tie the two opposite knots of her parents' ideas. This drew her to Ralph Waldo Emerson's theories and ideas, as they represented a more complete way of living out of the transcendental philosophy. Her journals illustrate her love for his philosophies, calling him the man who has helped me most by his life, his books, his society. Emerson's philosophy on how good deeds bring happiness and satisfaction to one's life deeply affected Louisa and her written works. Louisa was as well heavily affected by Goethe's ideas of self-reliance. Topic of self-reliance is a constant theme in Little Woman and essentially important when getting to know the characters. Blogger Kelly Rohn writes, "As a German immigrant, Professor Bear understands and experiences hard work and struggle. He bears in mind the responsibility he has in caring for a woman if he is to marry. He is more grounded and stable than Laurie, whose idealized hopes of marriage remind me of Louisa's own description of her imprudent father. Quote, he was a man in a balloon, with his family holding the ropes trying to hold him down to earth." Here's a quote from Little Woman. "In a minute a hand came down over the page so that she could not draw, and Laurie's was said, with a droll imitation of a penitent child, 'I will be good, oh, I will be good.' But Amy did not laugh, for she was in earnest, and tapping on the outspread hand with her pencil said soberly, 'Aren't you ashamed of a hand like that? It's as soft and white as a woman's, and looks as if it never did anything but wear Chewin's best gloves and pick flowers for ladies.' Amy being a working-class girl, she doesn't have any problems reminding Laurie that he has not worked a day in his life." Many Alcott scholars believe that the poor nutrition in Fruitlands might have affected on Louisa's hormonal balance. Same as Joe, Louisa was a tomboy. Louisa was very protective of her mother, who she adored, and her love for her family was fierce. From very early on she took the role of the provider, or the way Jo describes herself as the man of the house. and Alcott was 11 years older than her literal counterpart Meg March when she married. Same way as Jo grieved Meg marrying, so did Louisa, not because John, the real and the fictional one, was a bad person, but because it meant the change in the family dynamics. In the book, Jo says that she'd rather marry Meg herself, which has led many to believe that Jo is a lesbian, but with Jo there is no context for her fear, because Jo's childhood was quite safe and idyllic, whereas Louisa's was more unstable and turbulent. Family went through a lot together. Louisa was upset when Anna announced that she was getting married. Anna was 28 at the time and Louisa was 27. It happened only 3 weeks after they had lost their sister. Louisa's wish to keep the family together and fear of losing it is understandable. If you do research on Transcendentalists, you will soon find out that there was a great deal of gender fluidity. I would highly recommend Susan Bailey's article on the 19th century female relationship in Little Woman. I will add the link to the description. We live in a culture in which it is common not to try and understand what the other says and means, in this case the author, but to assume it is some preconceived idea or trope we have in our heads. We of something that we hate, we love, or we want to think that we are. It is a pity that it is so, because when we erase the fragility and faults of characters, we deprive ourselves from seeing the reflection of our own in them, and learn and grow. Masculinity and femininity are social structures made of biological and cultural factors. Jo struggles to find a balance between the two during the time when the world between man and woman was separated. There is a stereotype that Jo is quite adventurous. Is she? She's quite adventurous inside her head, and she's good at making up stories and likes acting. Writing is a safe escape to live vicariously, because she can do that from a safe place. With Laurie, she can live in Boysford through his masculine energy. Jo likes to speak about sports and such, but because of her gender, she's prevented to join any teams. In the first book, after Laurie pretended to be John Brooke and catfished Meg with letters and deeply hurt her, which is never included in any movie adaptations, he asks Jo to go to Washington with him and surprise Mr. Brooke. Jo is tempted by the idea, but she sees that such a trip is Laurie's way of getting away from his grandfather. Jo likes to dream, but she knows that reality would be completely different, and Laurie never grows if he doesn't learn from his mistakes. Louisa's attempt, however, is not to make certain habits in a person clearly masculine or feminine, but to blur the lines. Jo is good at sewing, and in fact she's a good dressmaker, likes to knit and mend clothes. Louisa herself liked sewing. We see all the girls sewing together in the beginning of the 1933 film, and in the 1949 film Jo sews and knits. In the book, Jo sees that Mr. Bear is mending his own socks, and she is both surprised and impressed about it. She's impressed how self-reliant he is. Some readers have found it odd how Jo wants to start a school for boys. When Jo sees the hungry look in Laurie's eyes when he looks at her family, she practically adopts him. Louisa in her personal life was devoted to charity work, and she worked as a nurse. Taking care of others was something that came naturally to her. Gender fluidity continues in the sequels. The character of Nat is very sensitive, musical, and a lot like Laurie. Dan is almost too masculine and doesn't want to show his vulnerability. In Little Men, Jo's niece Daisy complains how boys won't include her into their games, and Jo privately thinks that in the house that is filled with boys, the only girl is the most difficult to please. She gets Daisy a small toy stove and teaches her to cook while turning it into a play. This is not the 15-year-old Jo who thinks that everyone should be like her. Instead, she supports Daisy's individuality. Daisy's femininity is balanced by Nan, who is another tomboy. Even her name is a mixture between Nat and Dan. Jo doesn't like to go to parties or social events like Meg and Amy do. She rather stays at home and writes. Jo doesn't fit well to Concord or the traditional female role. She's allowed to be herself in her home. She does compare herself to Meg, and the way she is treated differently for being traditionally feminine. Same happens with Amy in the second book. Jealousy Jo sometimes feels is caused by the fact that her sisters are better accepted than she is because of her nonconformity, and this causes Jo feelings of isolation. In chapter Calls, Shealy speaks to pets and plays with the children of the house and talks with the adults. Jo makes the assumption that the aunts take her to Europe, even after when she has blurted to Aunt Carol that she hates French. Neither she seemed to have put much effort to study languages, which would be quite important if she would have seriously wanted to go to Europe with the aunts. Jo dreams about the foreign, but if she was abroad, especially with people like Aunt March who she had difficult relationship with, Jo would be rather homesick. In New York, Jo hesitates in the door of the newspaper quite a while when she tries to sell her first story. She rather spends time with Friedrich than goes to see new acquaintances, and in her letters to Mommy and Bet, she writes that she feels shy among strangers. Friedrich is based on several people in Louisa's life, and I have traced Friedrich to 5 different men, and I intend to talk about all of them in these essays. I agree with many Alcott scholars that philosopher Henry David Thoreau was the real-life Friedrich. I have made an entire video about his and Louisa's relationship. Check it out after you have finished this one. I am now going to read you some passages from Little Woman and Walter Harding's Thoreau biography. Thoreau's invited the Alcotts in for the Sunday dinner. Thoreau quickly realized that Alcott provided a very different intellectual fare than did even the most stimulating Concord farmer. The two found much in common to talk about, and Alcott often read to Thoreau from his correspondence with his English disciples on theories of education. While the rest of the world was denouncing Bronson Alcott as an impractical dreamer, Thoreau was able to overlook his faults and foibles, of which there were unquestionably many. Little Woman chapter Surprises. Mr. Bear's face had lost the absent-minded expression and looked all alive with interest in the present moment. Actually young and handsome, she thought, forgetting to compare him with Laurie as she usually did with strange men. Then he seemed quite inspired, though the burial customs of the ancients to which the conversation had strayed might not be considered an exhilarating topic. Jo quite glowed with the triumph when Teddy got quenched in an argument, and thought to herself as she watched her father's absorbed face, how he would enjoy such a man as my professor to talk with every day. This part reminded me the way Jo notices how Friedrich is helping the servant girl. Even the household maids were delighted, for Thoreau was always ready and willing to mend what was broken, even before they could call them to his attention. Henry appears in multiple disguises in Louisa's novels. He's Friedrich in Little Woman, Dan Keene in Little Man and Jo's Boys, Adam Warwick in Moods, David in Work Story of Experience, and Mac in Rose in Bloom, just to name a few. Quite many of Louisa's diary markings about Henry are censored. Still 160 years ago people had right to their privacy. Thank you for watching, guys. Next video is going to be all about the umbrella and the way Jo wishes that she would have someone to help her with her writings much before she travels to New York. Make sure to tune back.
Remember, you said, I'm pretty sure it was you, where you said that Meg and John were the more grounded type, Laurie and Amy are the romantic type, and then Jo and Friedrich somehow are a mix of the two. Like, they're grounded in the sense of, like, what is the realistic, but, like, they are deeply romantic with each other, and that it carries on through the year.
One of my friends said that always writing all these things to her journals, how she was lonely and envied her sister's marriages and how she wanted to get married. It was not something that she could say to the public if she had this fear that people pity her because she was a spinster, but also that during that time it would not be something even appropriate to tell that I'm not married because I'm lonely. She was always afraid that she would lose her face. I've been reading this now from a couple of different sources that she paid Laddie Wisniewski some money that he would not go to the press and chat about their, I don't know if it was affair or a kiss or something more. But I think it's very clear that Louisa was afraid that people would find out that she had affairs with men.
Yeah.
I think it was one of the Alcott studies that I read that Louisa and her publisher, they were the ones who came up with the spinster image so that they could sell her books, especially for the children, because the children were her target audience. Even though nowadays a lot of people see Little Woman more as a young adult novel, or some people even as an adult novel, but back then it was really targeted for children. I don't think Little Woman is necessarily a children's book, because I think
it opens up a lot better when you have some news behind. Right. But I think it explains a lot about why people have so many misconceptions about Louisa and marriage. There is a very big difference between this public image that Louisa and her publisher, Thomas Niles, created for her so that they could sell her works. And then there is this private Louisa who had these crushes to her older male friends, and I think she did fall in love to Henry David Thoreau, and she had a fling with Laddie Wisniewski. She was a very passionate woman who did want career and a romance and marriage. I also read the early Alcott schoolers because they didn't really want to make the difference between the two. They cut out all these certain parts about her diaries and didn't include them into the public statements about Louisa Mayalcott. It's really interesting when you go back to the Louisa Mayalcott research and how in different time periods certain elements have been removed from Louisa Mayalcott studies. I think I read that in the 70s when the 1970 series came out, there was this big anti-Friedrich and anti-Laurie movement in Alcott research because of that series, the way it portrayed Laurie and Friedrich. And I kind of understand that because I don't think that series does a really good job with portraying the male characters, but it's also a really shame in terms of the research if you take this very angry feminist approach to the male characters.
The BBC version you're talking about, right?
Yeah, the one where Friedrich is really angry and he finds out that she has been writing sensational stories.
Yeah, that one is a very unusual version. I also remember that they did, like, Mr. March felt a little weird. Like, I was like,
Yeah.
like, that doesn't seem right to his character to just kind of be oblivious like that. Because the one scene that stands out particularly is when Friedrich comes to visit and he's like, oh my God, it's you. And like takes into like the study and just doesn't even realize that like, oh, maybe Joe wanted to see Friedrich. Like, I was like, that seems so totally not in character with Mr. March. And like, I don't know. It was like, it is a very unusual version. And not to say that the BBC couldn't do a version of Little Women because obviously they're British and more American, but like it almost felt at times like it was making fun of it. Like they kind of had moments where I was just like, I don't know if you're making fun of the story or not. Like there was something very off about it, which I almost felt it was a shame because it does have some good moments. Like I think the actress that plays Jo is good. Like she could have been a really good Jo. She seemed to have that same sort of characteristic and had a really good Laurie proposal scene. I thought that was actually, again, one of the closest to how the novel plays it out. And you really do kind of sit there like, Laurie, you little jerk, like just leave her alone. It's tough. And that one, for anyone that doesn't know, because I took the time to do it, that is so far to date the only version that has an actual German Friedrich.
Half German, half English, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to find my thing, the post that I made, because one day I was just so bored. I was like, let me just see how many of them are actual German versus. Yeah, so I found it. For anyone that is curious, Paul Lucas from the 33 version is Hungarian. Rossano Brazzi from the 49 version is Italian. Then Friedrich Jaeger from the 1971 that we're discussing is German. Shatner from 78 two-parter is Canadian. Gabriel Byrne from 1994 is Irish. Mark Stanley from the Masterpiece Theater miniseries is English. Ian Bowen from the modern day one is American, and Louis Garrel is French. I was just curious one day. I was just like, let me just research this, and I gotta say, as unusual as the 1970 version is, it had that going for him, but I was like, that's a shock. Like seriously, only out of all of those, and that's mainstream versions, one of them is the closest to how the book version is. They're very bizarre.
Yeah, it's not very loyal to the book. I think really good job with Amy and Laurie in Europe. The dialogue was very close to the book, but then it also had that scene of Laurie catfishing Meg, which also in the book, but then I got so mad because they framed it to be Meg's fault. none today because it was all Laurie's fault.
Right, and it's not fair to say that's Meg's fault when why would she ever suspect that, Laurie would ever do such a thing? As harmless as his other tricks before, she probably was just like, whatever, but that was not harmless. That was a very mean thing to do, and that's like the moment where you're kind of like, Laurie, that was very low of you to go that way. But again, I'm not a fan of any version that has an adult playing Amy, and I think as good as she was, like you said, when she's more an adult and they're in Europe, I think that's a good sequence. But as a child, she just that actress got on my nerves. I couldn't stand listening to her screech that way. So it was the same thing with that Amy in the 1978 version. It just was like, oh my God, just grow up. You are a grown up, so act like it.
You cannot have an adult woman playing a child without making the character looking immature. It happens every time, every single time.
And I do say I give props to the 1949 version that obviously when you look at them, Margaret O'Brien is younger than Elizabeth Taylor. So in that one, they actually switched it to be that Amy is older than Beth. While that is not accurate, I can appreciate that they did try to accommodate it so that way it doesn't look wrong. Like, again, you can't convince me that Margaret O'Brien is older than Elizabeth Taylor. So far, only the 94 version and the 2008 modern day version actually did do a split between child Amy and adult Amy. And it makes Amy so much more sympathetic when you kind of look at her like she's just a little girl. She wants to be with the older sisters, which is something I relate to. I mean, I'm the youngest of 4 and my sister is 5 years older than me. So I always kind of had that feeling of like, can I come soon? It's like, no, you're not old enough for this. No, you can't because, this is something that only, let's just say if I was 10 and she was 15, like, sorry, only teenagers can do this or you're not old enough for that. Like, so I definitely can identify with Amy of that feeling of, but I want to join too. It's not fair. Like, and you feel bad because you're just like, no, she's just a little kid. But when you do get like an older actress playing the part and doing the whole book burning scene, it doesn't feel as sympathetic to Amy, and you do have that sort of feeling of like, well, Jo's right to be mad at her for as long as she has because she's an adult and she should know better. Whereas with the little kid, it's like, it was really bad that she did that, but you gotta understand she is a little kid. Be a little bit more forgiving towards her. I don't know why they feel the need to. The only thing I can think of is that they kind of, I'm assuming in general, Hollywood, when they do like cast a older actress to play a younger person to try to carry out, is that they think that somehow you're going to lose momentum or you'll lose something in that. But I'm like, I can't buy, as much as I do like Lily James, I can't buy Lily James being a young Natasha in War and Peace. She's a little bit too mature looking to be a 12-year-old. If you told me 16, I'd be like, that's a stretch, but whatever, I can buy that more than 12. I don't really understand it, and it really loses a lot of the character for me.
One of the things that came out about Amy in the book is that when she was 12, what she really wanted was Jo's approval. Well, she wanted Jo to like her, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think Jo also resented that Amy was so feminine, and there's nothing wrong with her being feminine either. One of the things that I really liked about part 2 was this description how Jo and Amy would fight about something and then they would burst up laughing when they realized that it's really stupid, this arguing they're having. Amy wasn't anti-Jo or Jo wasn't anti-Amy. They were just sisters.
Again, I sort of draw parallels between my sister and myself. Like, I don't know if we were very close when we were younger. And it's the same with like no matter who you are sibling-wise, whether you're 2 boys, 2 girls, 1 boy, 1 girl type situation. But when you reach a certain age, you're like, I want to do the things I want to do and not have to spend all my time with my little sister or little brother. The younger sibling kind of feels like you're leaving me behind. But once you get to a certain age, you kind of almost reconnect. Like, I feel like I'm definitely closer with my sister now because now we're both adults and we both have that better understanding of each other. And not that there was never any love between us in all those years. There was. It does in a way. And I think in general, children are unintentionally selfish. We just kind of go like, I want to do what I want to do at this age. And I don't care if my little sister wants to come along. It's what I want to do. Why should she? She can't come along, and I'm not going to accommodate for that because I've earned my years to be able to do this, and I'm not going to be held back by her. So yeah, I don't think that it was ever, like you said, anti-Joe, anti-Amy against each other. It's just whatever the points they were in their lives, it just did not lead them to be as close as they were. But as they gotten older, they sort of understand themselves better as well as each other, and that helped to create a more closer and more developed relationship where they can actually be more like friends. I think that people tend to pit them together because they both do so well with Beth. Between the two of them, they have a little bit more conflict. They grow out of it. And particularly, I felt with the Gerwig version, they put more attention on Joe and Amy's relationship and how it's symbolism because they're so different and contrasting each other. And it's just like, I don't know. I don't feel like there's that much thought into it. Just in general, that's just the nature of how sibling relationships are. You start off being like, oh, my little sister, my big sister. And then you grow into that age of, I want to do more of the adult things. And I don't want to be around my little sibling as much as I used to. And then sort of reconnecting because like, oh yeah, like now that we're sort of closer in the sense of age mentality, we can do those things together. So yeah, I think people overblow the Joe and Amy relationship as if it is this full-on sibling rivalry, which it really is not at all.
I was really surprised because when I did the research on Louisa Mayalcott's relationship with May Alcott, yeah, there was some sibling rivalry between them when they were younger. Like I said about the Angry Feminist and the 70s version, I think a lot of the Alcott schoolers, well, not necessarily Alcott schoolers, but public in general, when they are interpreting Little Woman in different times, they always tend to go to TV version or a film version instead of the book. When I was doing the research about the sisters, it really boggled my mind that there were so many Alcott schoolers who were writing how, Louisa envied May when she was living in Europe and she was hanging out with Laddie Wisniewski. Then I read his letters between Louisa and May. It seems that they both were fed up with him. And I not only had Louisa given him money, I don't know if it was for, shutting him down for their thing or whatever it was, or if she wanted to help him financially, I don't know. It seemed that May might have also borrowed him money because she writes in a letter to Louisa that he never paid his debt back. And people are always saying, oh, yeah, you really shouldn't hate Laurie that much. I don't hate Laurie. Laurie, he grows in his relationship with Amy, and I really like that. That's a big part of his character. But I can't deny the fact that all these real-life Lauries, Laddie Wisniewski and Alf Whitman, was also a friend of the Alcotts. Laddie was an adult man, and he seems to have been borrowing money from his wealthy friends and didn't really seem to be very reliable or very interested in work. And then I think May also wrote about Alf that, well, he seems to be a bit lost in life and doesn't really have a direction. That sounds a lot like Laurie. I read so many bad studies about Louisa and May and how they were fighting, quote-unquote fighting over Laddie, who was living in Paris at the same time as May. Then it doesn't really align with the letters that the sisters wrote to each other. And why on earth would they fighting about this guy? I think Louisa wrote Laurie to be this aspiring character who actually grows out from the disillusions that he has about artist life. It's not just Laddie and Alf who were models for Laurie. You can find it from all these different books that Louisa read and all these young men who she might hang out with. I think it's really dismissive for both the literal Joe and Amy and then the actual Louisa Mayalcott and Mayalcott to present them as these sisters who just were having this love and hate relationship and only thought about this guy who actually wasn't really that great. I actually really like Laurie in Ghost Boys and Middleman when he's helping Matt and he brings all these poor boys to Joe. He also always says that Joe was the one who raised him. He doesn't speak about Joe as his first love or girlfriend. I just don't like the romanticization of the young Laurie. I think a lot of these Alcott schoolers who try to present Joe and Amy, these people who just fight over Laurie, it's not based on the book, it's based on the adaptations. I say the same about the people who say that, oh, Joe and Friedrich just argue. Well, they don't argue in the book. They argue in pretty much every single adaptation.
I always have felt that out of all of them, that Joe and Friedrich would be the ones that have the best communication skills because, like you said, they never argue or yell at each other. They always just somehow manage to discuss the situation. And I think people also sort of think that it's sort of like, they just know that, oh, Joe has a temper. And they think she carries that throughout, that she always has a temper. But like, she knows how to control it by the time she goes to New York. And most of the adaptations will have it kind of like play out as if like, oh, there's that temper of hers. But like, no, she kind of learned how to control it thanks to like Marmee and even Mr. March when he comes back. But it's also not in Friedrich's nature to either. He's not a temperamental type of guy. And as we find, Joe has tempers when she reacts to something negatively in a very strong way. Like, we never see her yell at Beth. She never yelled at Beth for anything, even if they do disagree, because why would you yell at Beth? She's the least offending person ever. And I feel if I had to compare Friedrich to any of the sisters, it would be to Beth. He is a very quiet, gentle soul who is, unlike Beth, is able to, when the moment needs to arise, he will stand up and say, no, I don't agree with that. He's more willing to put himself out there if the situation comes to it. He'll kind of sit there and be like, I may not agree, but that's fine. But if something, like as we see in the novel, when they're at the symposium and someone says something in regard to religion, that was like that moment where he's like, sorry, I need to stand up and say something, but in the nicest way possible with strong facts to hold him behind. And that's when Joe gets an extra boost of respect for Friedrich. So it would be very surprising and almost negative towards Joe's character to say, one, that this temper that she's been working on all of a sudden comes back, and to say that she would yell at someone who is so unoffensive. Unlike with like Laurie, who like yells and says these very negative things towards her, does she respond negatively? Whereas with Friedrich, he approaches it in a very kind and more gentler way. So there is no reason for her to respond in that way. Yeah, I don't really understand why people feel that it's so important to have them argue when it's not close to who their characters are, and it changes how you sort of almost see their characters, because why would Friedrich act that way when he doesn't, and why would Joe yell at him when there's no reason to yell at him?
And I think Amy also had a very calming influence on Laurie. Amy's a very visual person, and then you have Laurie, who likes these very pretty things. He likes nice clothes, and well, in the modern context, he would be a metrosexual. A man who likes to take care of his looks, which is kind of opposite to my man Fritz.
There are times when Joe makes fun of Laurie. Like, he likes to buy nice clothes and fancy gloves, and Joe laughs about it because why are you spending your money in these irrelevant things? So she doesn't really have much appreciation for Laurie taking care of his looks. And one of my friends pointed out that all the three couples have their own special aesthetics, so to speak. Like John and Meg, they have this whole cottagecore aesthetic. And with Joe and Friedrich, they are not too picky. Joe was that kind of person who didn't really romanticize life, even though Joe and Fritz are a very romantic couple, like you said.
but Joe was never a very visual person in Little Man. It's all
Hello, friends. It is Niina from the Little Woman podcast. Just to let you all know that the Little Woman podcast episode transcripts are now available as books. You can find them as paperbacks and ebooks. They are wonderful reading for all the fans of Louisa Mayalcott. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
like she and Fritz have this mutual agreement that Plumfield is going to be this topsy-turvy, upside-down place. If boys' sticky hands make places dirty, that's okay. And we can have pillow fights once a week so they can release their energy. And then it's completely different in the Lawrence house because Amy and Laurie, they like to have these fancy balls and dinner parties and things to be visually pleasing. And I always thought that Amy and Laurie were a match made in heaven because him being a metrosexual, for example, was something that Amy found visually pleasing. And of course, Joe found Friedrich very attractive. I really love that scene when Amy and Laurie are in Europe and she pats his hand and says, "This is like a lady's hand. You haven't done any work in your life." And Amy knows the struggles of being poor, and Laurie doesn't have any experiences of that. And then Amy says that Joe hates lazy people. And Amy herself also hates lazy people. And that is Laurie's wake-up call. That's when he turns from a boy into a man. Oh, that scene is never in any Little Woman adaptation between 1933 and 2019. Then if we think about Louisa Mayalcott, she worked as a nurse in the war. She took care of sick people. She saw bodies lying around. She wasn't squeamish, maybe because she didn't really consider herself very attractive always. And that also had to do with her illness. When you read Little Woman, there is sometimes criticism the way people tend to pay more attention to the way things look outside than the way they look inside. You know what I mean. Joe is not a very visual person.
I almost forgot about the pillow fight. I was like, oh, that's just so adorable. But yeah, each relationship worked out for each of them in the best way. Friedrich and Joe are a little bit more like, oh, let's just do whatever suits us at whatever time. And Laurie and Amy are like this people who are like, we have to have dinner ready by 5 every day because we just have to. No earlier, no later. But it works for them because that is the lifestyles that they want. And if you have someone like Joe who is like, let's just eat whenever, whatever, and Laurie is like, no, I want to have this specific time with this specific meal, that's going to clash. Again, I think that's what makes how she handles the relationships very well, that it's not even just like, oh, you can trade one sister for another. It's like, no, they're so different. Their relationship with Laurie is so different that it will not have the same outcome as you think that it will. You can't have Laurie just be with Joe and expect it to have the same outcome as Laurie and Amy. It just won't. Not at all. And it's funny, like this is in some ways it's a story of like opposites attracting as well as people who are similar attract. Like you often hear people say differently, like he was someone who is completely different from you, but then you have some people who are like, get someone that is completely the same to you. And I gotta find the passage, but I think Marmee kind of said it perfectly. This is when Joe wants to leave for New York, and Marmee says, oh, I think it's not just because of you wanting to leave, it's also because of Laurie. I gotta find it, but she says that as friends you are very happy and your frequent quarrels soon blow over. I fear that you both would rebel if you made it so light. You are too much alike and too fond of freedom, not to mention hot-tempered and strong wills, to get on halfway with each other. In relation that needs infinite patience and forbearance as well as love. So on one hand, the fact that they are very similar is going to be detrimental to them. That would ruin their relationship, because really what makes a relationship work is what is similar about the two of you is your morals, your points of views on some of the bigger topics of things and of your interests. But you need to be different enough to allow some sort of growth,
to happen, because if you have two people who are exactly the same and have the same sort of ways of living life, there's a very slim chance, I think, of them progressing into something more deep and meaningful. I think, it's going to be a very kind of like, what do you want to do today? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. And then just you do nothing. Versus if you get someone that is at the very least a little different from you and you go, I don't know, what do you want to do? And like, well, why don't we do something a little different and out of our comfort zone, and let's do it. Let's go. Like, I think that in a way they both have that, like you said, Amy pushed Laurie to be more responsible and to sort of realize like what a grown-up he needs to be. And Friedrich kind of helped ground Joe and be, and not to say like, he tells her like, you can still have that dream. Like, you can still be a writer. You can do it. I believe that you can. In a way, they both, Amy and Friedrich, are what Joe and Laurie need, because in some ways they ground them, but also give them what it is that they need, not necessarily what they want. Laurie thinks what he wants is a housewife that is just going to do what he wants him to do. What he needed was a wife that is like, you know what, you could stand to do a few chores around this house. I think that's why some people feel like, have that idea of like, Joe and Laurie would be great together because they're so similar, but like, therein lies the problem. They're too similar and they're too like a reflection of each other. And I think if you spend too long and too often with someone that is just like you're going to see some of the more negative stuff about yourself, and you're not going to like it. You're going to hate how you are as a person, and then you're going to maybe start resenting that person because you recognize some of the more negative stuff about yourself. And you're like, you know what, I can grow and learn from this. But the person that you're with has not done the same. And you're like, I'm moving ahead and you're staying right there. We want different things. And so, yeah, I think no matter what, Joe and Laurie's relationship would have ended into the disaster, because one will grow and the other will not. And you can't have a relationship where you're not going together somewhere. If you eat, whether it's the both of you stay in the one place or one stays and one goes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you said that, Joe and Frick, they don't really have any reasons to argue. Henry and Louisa, what I read, they have this sort of telepathic way of communication, that they would understand each other without words. I think you can see some of that in Little Woman, in Joe's and Friedrich's, the way they communicate. Like you said, well, they probably have the least problems in communication when it comes to the different couples in Little Woman, because they know each other so well. So it's really interesting that Louisa and Henry would have this sort of telepathic rapport between one another. And, even though Louisa had temper tantrums, Henry was, what I read, quite a peaceful person and didn't really care too much about arguing. I mean, I think it brings another extra layer to Little Woman and to Joe's and Friedrich's relationship. I think you can see a lot of that in Little Men, especially when they have this sort of teasing conversation between one another. Well, they really don't argue a lot in the sequels, and they don't argue in Little Woman. Why would they argue? They really don't. They don't have any big conflict. Joe and Laurie are the ones who have the conflict. And even with Meg and John, well, I think there was a reason for that argument. And after that, they were a better couple. Meg realized she had problems with leaving behind this idea, but she did wish that sometimes they would have more money. And John realized that, well, Meg has more needs.
It's a growing thing, it's not easy. I mean, I've not yet to have been in a relationship, but talking between my friend and seeing my sister go through some of her relationships, it's a growing thing. You gotta learn each other's idiosyncrasies, and you gotta learn, like, what does it mean to have another person in your life that is so close to you. It's just like when people say, like, when they have kids, they have that realization of like, oh, I just have realized that it's not going to just always be about me. Sometimes it's about them. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily are sacrificing the overall picture of what you want for them, but just kind of taking a step back and going like, I got to realize that even though I approach this situation this way, it doesn't work when I go with this person of whom I am living with and love and whatnot. So yeah, I think that with Meg and John, because they were already so shy with each other in the beginning of their relationship, that it took a little bit more time for them to sort of understand what does it really mean to be in love and to be married. They're such an underrated Little Women couple. It's such a sweet little romance. It's like, oh, they love each other, and like, you know, watching them kind of blossom into these developed parents who truly care for their children. Surprisingly, John being a lot more hands-on than you'd expect any man from that time period to be hands-on with their kids. But yeah, it really goes to show that, you know, marriage is not always as easy as one would think.
In Little Woman, when there was the catfishing sequence, I think there was a moment when afterwards Meg was like looking that Laurie wasn't going to do any kind of jokes with John. She was keeping an eye on him more closely because she didn't want nothing bad to happen to John. I think I would do the same if that happened to me. John is really underrated character. Like, I always loved that scene when they're in the Camp Lawrence and he's defending Meg being a governess. And he's like, oh, he's American girls, then if are no legging too. Right. So, such a great scene.
I don't really think that moment in particular is really seen in any version. I mean, we do have certain versions that do have like the beach/boating scene and those like first hints of like, you know, oh, I don't have any family to worry about. Meg being like, oh no, well, I would miss you if something were to happen. Like, it's precious, and you know, the fact that he is so patient with her because like he knows that he loves her, but you know, he knows that maybe Meg isn't fully sure, but he's not pressuring her in the same way that the way Laurie would have. He just is like, it's all right, you know, I'll wait if you'd like, and I'm always here if you do realize that you do love me. But that's okay. You take your time. You do what you gotta do. Something like he is still such a sweet character, and the fact that he just wants he wants Meg to be happy, even at the sacrifice of getting a new coat for her to get a dress, is just so sweet. And it's such a big moment for Meg to kind of be like, you know what, I don't need a dress, I just need you. And it's such a lovely little relationship that really doesn't get as much love as the other two comparatively, and I think that's a shame.
Both Friedrich and John, they feel parallel in that sense that they both feel at some point that they are not worth of this woman. With John is that Meg has all the pressure to marry a rich guy because she is the prettiest of the sisters. And especially Marge wants her to marry some rich man. And then there is that rumor going on that Meg has something going on with Laurie. And Mom is really mad about it, and which is understandable. But I think John also felt that he was too poor for her. Because, you know, Meg came from a poor family too. He didn't felt that he could give what she needed. That's also one of the reasons why he waited for her. I love that scene in Little Woman when Friedrich feels that he's not worthy of Joe, but it's also because he thinks that Joe is engaged to Laurie, and he can only base his views on Laurie to what Joe has told him, which is not a lot, annoyed that he's this rich neighbor and Joe's best friend. And that's pretty a lot when you're in love with this girl and you hear that, okay, are they engaged? And he doesn't know that. And then he's so happy when he comes to Concord a year later, and then he finds out that Amy and Laurie are married. Joe is available.
Like, I always kind of, again, props to the 1970 version, as flawed as it is, they do handle that scene exactly as I kind of imagined it in the book, where, like, he's like, oh, yes, you're the friend. Hi, nice to meet you. And Laurie's like, oh, yeah, this is my wife. And he's like, oh, you're married. Okay, well, we can be friends. Like, now there's nothing holding me back from, you know, But the fact that he was willing to gracefully kind of step aside for Joe, if that was the case, is very endearing too. Like, it's only until after he realizes that Laurie is married to Amy and is not at all with Joe that he's like, oh, okay, now I can finally say my feeling. Which is very true with every version. Like, when he finds out that there is no Joe and Laurie, it's like, okay, now I can finally say what I feel. Otherwise, before I was just willing to internalize it and just make me feel sad forever. Poor Friedrich. He was willing to do that for Joe if that was what she had wanted, but that ended up working well for everyone.
Such a nice scene where he's like, oh, and then the narrator mentions how Laurie thought he was nice. It's a really funny scene. I really love the whole courting episode in the novel. He was best for Joe.
Again, it sort of makes me go like, oh, you two idiots, you love each other. Like, like how, they always seem to be just happening to meet up at the same spot. Like, oh, I didn't see you there. Maybe I'll go with you to see your sister. And maybe I'll come home for a spot of coffee. I mean, not that I was waiting to see you. Joe being all like, Friedrich, oh, I mean the professor, his coffee this way. Like, it's very clear to everyone except to each other, it would seem that you are madly in love. But, like, I guess love makes you share one brain cell in this case. But then it leads to probably one of the most romantic scenes ever, with them just taking shelter of each other under an umbrella and saying how much they just love each other. Just all comes out in this moment of, I believe you're going away, and that makes me sad. It's like, no, I'm not going away. I promise I won't leave you. I love you too much. Like, it's just, I love it. I love that scene so much.
It's a really romantic proposal.
And nothing to give you but a full heart and empty hands, and the whole her taking his hand saying not empty now. It's like, this is true classic romanticism, when people talk about like Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy holding Lizzie's hand, and people want to say Joe and Friedrich are not romantic. How dare you? You must not have read or watched that scene properly.
It's like when people say that Joe and Friedrich are not passionate enough. Then in the umbrella chapter, he's holding his face crying, and then he asks her, why are you crying? And then she's like, 'cause you're going away. And then we find out that he has been keeping Joe's poem with him for months and months. And they pretty much start to make out right after the proposal.
Right, and the fact that Jill, like, is the one who pretty much jumps on Friedrich, like, the fact that, despite the fact they're in the middle of a muddy road, is like, I just gotta kiss you because I can't hold it in, and just them making out while people are passing them and the rain, their clothes are all muddy. Like, who cares? They gotta kiss here and now. Who cares who sees and whatnot? And particularly for back then, that was so scandalous.
Yeah, in the 19th century, it wasn't really seen as appropriate to have such public expression of affection. I read in another Louisa Mayalcott novel, in the Verb Story of Experience, because there's the moment when David, who is once again based on Henry David Thoreau, when he confesses his feelings for Christine, who is the protagonist, he almost has the similar blurt that Friedrich has in the Umbrella chapter, that he's been holding all these feelings inside, and then he just lets it all out there when he confesses his love for her. And I think, something that Louisa kind of recycles in the stories. I think there's something similar in Rose in Bloom, when Mac confesses his feelings to Rose. When I read about him, he's quite similar to Friedrich in that sense, that he would take his time to think things through before he would express his opinion or something that he really wanted to say. There's a lot of descriptions about him that he was sort of more of a deep thinker, and then also in some ways very passionate person. Yeah, I think some of that must have come from Louis' own experiences.
Oh my goodness.
Well, thank you, Christina, for joining me. This was lots of fun.
Yes, and thank you for inviting me. I've never been a part of a podcast before, so this is very exciting for me. And I hope that the listeners get a chance to, enjoy it as much as I did.
You can find you at Tumblr from the Joe and Friedrich blog. It's a great blog. People go and read it.
Thank you, Tumblr.
That was our chat for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.
Niina and I found each other. I had actually found her blog post about Professor Bear when I was preparing to make my long and very critical review of a new 2019 Little Women adaptation. And she reached out to me, and I realized I had read her work before, and we decided to do this collaboration because we love talking about Little Women and having long discussions about the adaptations of the book. And today we're talking about Professor Bear and Joe.
And I actually found Emily because one of my friends on Louisa Mayalcott group in Facebook told me that I should watch her video.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Kimberly, for all of this.
So flattered that people you took initiative to share the video.
I was so psyched when you reached out because I was like, I remember thinking would this person with my views, because I loved your post on Professor preparing all of the Fritzes and the actors, and you were like, oh, I wonder how the 2019 film is going to treat though. And then I came to the Flucose pair. I was like, well, so I'm so happy you stepped to me.
Professor Bear, he is kind of a topic of contention in the Little Women fan base. He kind of has been seen by a lot of people as someone who was shoehorned in at the last minute because Louisa Mayalcott, she was forced by her publisher to marry Joe off to somebody because that's what she needed to get her book published. She wrote this random guy and then married Joe off, and then that was that.
This is all propaganda, mostly shared by Joe and Laurie shippers.
That is also a thing because people were so upset that Joe didn't marry Laurie. So I think that's part of where the resentment for Professor
Evans,
and also I think Professor Bear is not a conventionally romantic hero, right? He's this older guy who's an intellectual, and he's not into genre fiction at all, and he doesn't really operate in these big romantic gestures in the way that Laurie does. And so I think a lot of people who really attach to say Laurie just really resent it.
And if you talk to Team Bear fans, pretty much a different story.
I mean, when you sent me those blog posts about him, I'm like, yeah, I feel so validated right now. Was never the type of person who would react well to romantic gestures. She hated it.
She did. She was really shocked when she realized in the first part of Little Woman that there's a rumor going on that Meg and Laurie are an item. She was shocked by the whole idea that there's something romantic going on. And she's really shocked by the idea that Laurie has feelings for her, romantic feelings. She's really resents that whole concept of being in love. But she's 15. She grows out of it. Yeah, she's a late bloomer, Joe.
Yeah, no, she doesn't quite awaken at the same time as everyone else.
She also sees the ridiculousness in some parts of Laurie's behavior because she knows that she's not really part of that idea that he has.
As we discussed before, Laurie doesn't really validate Joe's feelings like that, right? Because he keeps saying, "Oh well, Joe, someone will eventually you can get yourself to love somebody," or well, I'll get you someday. He says that a lot. But when she's not really someone who enjoys that sort of romantic chase. She's just a practical girl, and then that stuff just belongs in books.
She does have this romantic side of her, but she's very practical about it. In the first part of Little Woman, she's reading the book from Susan Warner, Wi-Fi Good. Yeah, that's the name of the book. That's one of the things that made me convinced that Louisa planned from the beginning that Joe ends up with Fritz. And she crafted Friedrich's character specifically for Joe. In that book, the whole storyline, it's very similar to Joe and Friedrich in Little Woman. I was so fascinated when I read light white word because it felt like I was reading Joseph Friedrich's story in like another dimension. It's really uncanny. It's very, very Christian book, many Christian moralities, but the dynamic between the leading lady and the romantic interest, they are very much the same. What's the name of the Light White World by Susan Warner? It's an American book from 1850. It was one of the first American feminist books, and I found it so fascinating. Jo is reading that book in Little Woman in chapter 11, I think. And she's reading that in a tree, and she's crying because it's so moving. And Jo actually reads romance novels.
Yeah, so she's not averse to romance.
Yeah.
She doesn't. She just wants it in a certain way.
She wants an equal romance. She wants someone who respects her. The White Red Bird is interesting because it's about these two people trying to find a balance in that relationship.
Yeah, no, it's a value that Louisa Mayalcott really espouses in all of her books. We get hints go early on that Jo, she likes a certain idea of romance, does not what Laurie, just not or how Laurie exhibits it. Like, so why do you think that? I think you will probably know more about this. So why do you think Louisa May Alcott would later write that, like, oh, Jo should have been like a literary spinster or say something like that?
She wrote it to her friend Elizabeth Powell, who was 16 years at the time. Elizabeth was Louisa's friend. I think she was a teacher in a school where Louisa was studying with her sister. And Louisa was much older than she was. And based on what I know, Elizabeth was very against marrying. And she was 16, well, it makes sense that you don't want to marry someone when you're 16, even in the 19th century. And I think Louisa specifically crafted that letter for Elizabeth.
Hello, friends. It is Niina from the Little Woman podcast. Just to let you all know that the Little Woman podcast episode transcripts are now available as books. You can find them as paperbacks and ebooks. They are wonderful reading for all the fans of Louisa May Alcott. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
Daniel Shealy, who is an Alcott schooler, he has done some extensive research about this. It's really worth reading. Elizabeth did get married a decade later. She was like 26 when she married. And it seems that her relationship was quite happy and she had 2 sons and she became a dean of a school. I think Louisa used Elizabeth as an inspiration for Jo's character in first part of Little Woman and in the sequels because this actually sounds a lot like Jo's and Friedrich's relationship as well.
Yeah.
But it was Elizabeth who Louisa wrote this letter that she gave Jo a funny match. But then she also writes in that letter that she's really frustrated about the little girls who want her to marry Jo to Laurie, because that was never Louisa's intention. People have taken that out of context. When Louisa herself was 15, she actually wrote love letters to her friend Emerson, who was 30 years older than she was. He was her first love, maybe her first crush. And she was very different to Jo in that sense because she was very romantic and very sentimental. But then I have also done research on Louisa's love for Henry David Thoreau, who I believe was one of the main models for Friedrich. And it's really uncanny how Henry comes out as in literal disguises in all of Louisa's novels. I think she wrote Jo to be an idealized version of herself because when I read Little Woman last time, Jo is not really as angry as she is in the movies, or especially in the recent movies like the 2019 film or in the 2017 series when she snaps out time to time.
Yeah.
But the book Jo, she's not that angry. People always say that Louisa had like anger issues and such. I think in the 19th century context, whenever a woman would get angry, would have been labeled something terrible. It has a lot to do with the way we read history and the way we approach Louisa's character. Jo is definitely a combination of the woman who Louisa admired.
Yeah, I think it's funny with the anger issues because I think it's more about how she talks back at people. I think it was the whole incident with Amy falling in the pond. I think she was just like, oh, in my anger, I left my sister behind and I almost let her die. I think it's that sort of thing where she's kind of governed by her feelings rather than her head, and I think that's more what they're getting at. Because I think Marmee, she's kind of a parallel to Marmee. because Marmee dealt with a lot of this stuff. When she was younger, she was always trying to hold back on her emotions and that's how Joe's father became a good foil to her. Joe's father was able to kind of calm her down, and then became harder again when they were poor because it's so hard for her to see her daughters be financially struggle and have to work. Characters don't take part in shaping these characters. Like these girls, these other people were necessary for them to grow.
Yeah, that's very true. And it applies to John and Meg, it applies to Amy and Laurie, and especially to Fitz. When Louisa was asked by her publisher to write a book to girls about good marriage matches, in the 19th century, German immigrants, they were really discriminated in the US. So she's also including this social aspect to the book, which I didn't realize until I started to do this research. I was really blown away by the German connections in Little Woman. Pretty sure that Louisa was a hardcore Germanophile.
Yeah, and look, what I still think I love about the 1984 adaptation is like when she's like, oh, well, my family was we're a family of transcendentalists, and that Friedrich's like, yeah, well, that's all the German philosophy, and this is what we were getting at.
And I love that scene so much. And I was so angry because Greta Gerwig's version, it did include this intellectual thirst that Joe has. Also in the 1949 film, in a way, Joe, she wants to study German. And it's not as good as in the 1994 film, but you can see that she has this intellectual curiosity towards Professor.
You can kind of see it with like he sort of opens for horizons of big music.
Yeah, and they go to the opera and everything. And I like that in the film, Friedrich is actually singing, and he's singing a song from, it's a song from Goethe, I think. That's a direct link to Louisa and her love for Goethe and all these philosophers who she was in love with. I really like that.
No, I love it when a film understands Fritz like that. If people think that, and I think you've pointed out in your blog post, or maybe another blog post did, or another article, but Friedrich Fair, he was not conventional on choice at all. Like even the choice of marrying someone like that was considered pretty out there because he was a German immigrant, like you said, and he had come from this position of respect to this kind of position of poverty, and for her to marry this guy who's not as well established in that country is probably discouraged against, and to make that choice, I mean that was not conventional. That's not someone just knuckling down to to society's demands. That's just a choice that wouldn't be expected of you at the time, and it's also very fitting of Joe because she's an unconventional woman, so she married an unconventional man.
Yeah, one of the Little Women fans who I interviewed for my articles, she pointed out that this unconventionality of Friedrich that Joe is really attracted to, because Joe always feels very unconventional herself, and that is why she doesn't fit to the circles in Concord. Joe being this female writer in a times when there weren't that many female writers, she finds this charismatic, eccentric professor. He doesn't really fit in, but he doesn't struggle with it the same way as Joe is struggling.
She respects hard work.
Yeah.
That's why she can't really respect Laurie at that point, or be with him, because Laurie doesn't work. Laurie can't relate to how Joe works hard.
He kind of resents Joe's writing in the book as well, and you can see bits of that in the 1994 film, like in one sentence, but still, at least it's included. In the book, you can really see that he's distracting her when she's writing, and then when Laurie's proposing to Joe, Joe is like, you are not going to like my writing, but you never have to write again in your life. Like, money resolves everything, but Joe wants to write. Friedrich wants her to write. Like, I don't understand these people who say that Friedrich somehow prevents Joe from writing. Like, yeah, he wants Joe to write. He wants Joe to be the best writer in the book, and he gives her
Shakespeare's books, so children study characters. He just doesn't like sensational stories because he thinks that show has much more potential.
When people say, "Oh no, he made it so that she wouldn't write," and I'm like, no.
And in all the movies, they don't include that chapter in the beginning of Little Women Part 2 when Joyce actually started to write those sensational stories. From the beginning, she knows that it's really bad writing. She does it for the money and she tries to justify it for herself. But she doesn't feel content by that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think, because people criticize Friedrich for being elitist and, criticize for writing genre fiction when, which he really needed to do it for the money. And I'm just like, well, the whole point, like, Louisa, like, even phrases it such that it's not good for Jo to write like that. It puts her in a bad state of mind when she is churning out sensationalist stories just for the money because it's not authentic to her. And Friedrich, he doesn't really directly like make her do anything. He left it up to her. Like he never made anything.
Alcott, Schooler, and Nacini wrote it very well, I think, when she said that when Louisa was younger, in her 20s, she wrote those potboiler stories, but Louisa didn't have anyone to guide her. And you can see that in Little Woman that she wants that there's someone who actually looks at her work, takes it more seriously, and gives her some advice on what to do. And she did it in secret. Later in life, Louisa didn't want to have anything to do with those stories. Now, I have read some of them, and I like some of them. Some of those stories are not that great. So she was practicing her writing. That's okay. But then she's also aware that she's not doing the best of work, and then she's really ashamed to show them to anyone.
She didn't want to be limited.
Yeah, it's really impressive when you read that Friedrich is giving Jo these advices how she can improve, and then Jo actually writes different genres. She tries poetry and children's books and all of that. Then she has a creative break. I'm an illustrator. That comes when I take creative breaks. You need that in order to improve yourself. Amy does that as well in the book. Like she tries sculpting watercolors and oils. Like
wood burning.
Yeah, she does it all. That's the way it goes when you're an artist. You try different things until you find your own thing.
Louisa, she really understood the creative process. It's like nothing comes to you overnight. And I mean, I think a lot of trails of artistry now in our modern culture are just a bit like, oh, well, this just came to the artist's head, it's fully formed, and it was great. And it's not true to the creative process at all. At times, these ideas, they have to develop over a long period of time. And she was not young when she wrote this book.
Yeah, she was 33, I think. She had been writing quite some time then. She wrote from experience. Jo in part 2 of Little Woman is Louisa writing and wanting that feedback. And there's that scene in the book when she's starting to write those stories. She's asking advice from all her family members. She wants that feedback, but they think she takes all the advice and then the story becomes horrible because she listens to everything what they are saying and she just changes and changes so it fits to all of them. But with Friedrich, he basically tells Jo to listen to herself, study different characters and read Shakespeare and get
he does a version of what Jo's dad does, right? Jo's dad is like, hey, just do something that's true to you. Don't let these people just do it for the bounty. And at first Jo's like, oh no, I need the money. And then, the novel flops, I think. And then, Friedrich is the one to kind of expand on what Jo's father was saying and being like, we should be creating meaningful, authentic work, not just stuff that brings in money.
I was reading Gine's book about Louisa. There was this diary marking of Louisa where she had written that Emerson had given her similar advice that she should write something that pleases herself and not things that please the crowds. So I think that's something that might have come from there. Then she had also advice from Henry David Thoreau and her publisher and the other people who care about her works. That's something that you can reflect on Little Woman and Jo's and Friedrich's relationship, because I'm not a writer, but I would imagine that writers would like to have romantic relationship with people who actually encourage them to write.
Yeah. I know you need someone to feed that work.
And Friedrich is very cultured, like he knows a lot about literature.
He is very earnest with her, and and holds her to high standards. That's another really important aspect of being a partner, is that you hold your partner to higher.
I really love Laddie Women, and I also really love the chapters that involve Friedrich and Joe. And since I also I was born in Germany, I really love the way Friedrich talks in the novels. And yes, I also love this chapter we're going to analyze.
Yes, I love it too. It's one of my favorites.
And I also think it's very romantic for everybody who says that Joe and Friedrich aren't romantic. I recommend reading that chapter again.
I think the problem is that it's not really in the adaptations, but it's so good, it should be there.
Yes, definitely. I think mostly in the movies or adaptations I've watched, it mostly is like Friedrich goes to visit Joe, kind of, and then that's the end. It's like only like one day, whereas in the novel, it continues, like their partnership continues, even at the home, not only in New York, but it also is where Joe lives. They have this extreme and powerful bond, and it only grows as the more he stays there.
And even when Joe leaves New York, they have continued writing letters. And I think you can only see that in some of the TV versions, because in the movies you just see them arguing and then they stop communicating, which is really weird, because that doesn't happen in the book at all. Some of the TV shows, they do show that they continue writing these letters. And when Friedrich comes to Concord, he's actually there for 2 weeks or something, courting her.
I actually have to say that I really like this chapter, like really. And I also think it is very important that Louisa Mayalcott included the fact that even when they were apart, they like continued writing letters to each other. And the chapter beforehand, Joe reads a letter from Friedrich, and he's like, oh, if only he would come. And it's like a wish come true to her.
Exactly. It's this secret wish that she has, that he would return back her life.
Yes, and I also think it's very important because Joe literally craves for company in this chapter. But the thing is, like, she has her mother with her and also her father, but she says that she wants to try all kinds of love that exist. Like, she isn't really satisfied any longer with only the love of her mother, of her parents, or of her sisters.
The previous chapter called All Alone, there's really this long monologue that she has about how lonely she is and how she longs to find love. And I think she says that her heart is so elastic and that she would like to try what romantic love feels like. And this is such a misunderstood part about Little Women. We have discussed about this before, that people really do not seem to read the book at all when they talk about Joe wanting to be independent or whatever.
Yes, and to be honest, I think, like, even if a woman, or human, has a partner, it doesn't make them not independent. Like, I mean, relationships can enrich people, and that is the same with Joe and Friedrich. He enriches her, but she still has her independent side, and they live together in a very beautiful harmony.
Yes, and if Joe would have married Laurie, that's when she would have lost her independence completely.
Because Laurie's demanding at that time, especially because we had Richard, were like, you have to take care of me, you are the mother to me, and since that's just what you did, you will take care of me 24 hours a day, and when I'm angry, you will do whatever I want you to, etc. I also think in this chapter, and surprises, she completely forgets to compare Friedrich to Laurie. And I think it's also like a funny thing because she has idealized Laurie very much, but in the end, she stayed true to herself and she fell in love with Friedrich because he is the right man for her. Laurie at that time was a man. He himself states that in that chapter.
Also, in this chapter, there is a apology from Laurie, which I find very feministing for Louisa Mayalcott to write. But like we have discussed in this podcast, and you and I have discussed this in our private discussions, that this is one of those things that is not in the adaptations either, because Laurie is so incredibly idealized. I think the only version where Laurie apologizes to Joe is the BBC series from 1970s, and most people have not even heard from it. So I am very glad that I get to discuss about the chapter surprises with you today, because I think this is completely overlooked chapter.
Yeah, I agree. It really is a wonder. And I also think this chapter is very important also for the growth of Laurie, because like we have seen him evolving and growing and improving, but this is kind of the climax, because he not only acknowledges his mistakes to himself and the others chapters, but he also acknowledges it to Joe when he says, I was making a mistake at that time and I'm sorry, because I think it is, like you said, first of all, very feminist to acknowledge it, that he forced her to being something she was not. But it is also very important because I don't think in many adaptations you don't really see his growth. And it's actually very sad. Like, in some, there is kind of an apology, I guess, but it doesn't really feel right because, I mean, in the movies, he kind of never did anything wrong.
Exactly. Like the proposal scene, it is often romanticized. You don't really see how uncomfortable Joe feels that in the book, the way he's treating her. That's a problem. So his apology in the book makes a lot of sense because Laurie himself realized that it wasn't the right thing to do.
That is true. And I also think it's important that Louisa Mayalcott did have Laurie apologize. It is also an ideal way of showing that men can change and better, and that they have to acknowledge it. Like, I think any other author wouldn't have just glossed over it, but I think it is very important that Louisa Mayalcott didn't gloss over it. And I think it's also important that Louisa Mayalcott did have Joe uncomfortable with Laurie being so possessive of her, because, I mean, who wouldn't feel uncomfortable when their friend would force them to something they didn't want?
Yes. It's kind of interesting because in later chapter, I think it's under the umbrella, Friedrich says that he thinks he knows Joe very well, and that's why he does not force himself to her. Then we have Laurie, who has known Joe since he was 15, and then he tries to force himself on Joe. And you would think that it would be the opposite.
Yes, that is very much true. And I often have to say, I really loved how Friedrich was introduced in New York. And I loved how great his character also is in this chapter, because when he comes to, I think, Orchard House to visit Joe and he sees that she's gone, and he at first doesn't want to go inside because she's busy and all that stuff. But then he stays because Joe looks at him in such a way, and because she just throws him into the house, kind of like she shawls him into the house. And how, he doesn't change for Joe. He doesn't pretend he is somebody else who talks to Joe's parents. He is still himself. And I also love that in this chapter, he looks at Laurie a great deal. And he also looks at Joe a great deal. And the fact that Joe is she has to keep her eyes focused because she is afraid that her eyes will look constantly at Friedrich is also very funny.
There's something about him that speaks right to her soul. It reminds me of that part in New York when he's speaking about religion, and then I think in that chapter he really becomes Joe's hero. So there's something similar that happens here.
Like I said, I really love Friedrich as a character, and I also love the fact that Louisa Mayalcott didn't just gloss over the fact that Friedrich was visiting her. It was a very important chapter, and it also let the audience know Friedrich even better, because he was there for Joe, but he also he wasn't only nice to Joe, he was nice to everybody around her because that is who he is.
You're pretty well educated when it comes to Louisa May Alcott. Would you like to tell a little bit how you got introduced to Little Woman and her writings?
It happened like this. I was kind of craving for reading something in English, and I was like, why not try some classic out? And then it was the first time I kind of discovered it, but there are kind of a few bad reviews, so I wasn't really sure, and I couldn't get a reading extract of it. So I thought to myself, let's wait a bit. But then, when I got to the shop to look for some English book, there again it was, and it was like the whole version of it, like I think 777 pages. And I read a bit into it, and I was like, okay, this is the novel I really want to read. So I started reading this one, and I fell in love with her writing. And then I read her other novels as well. And the one that also had a real big impact on me, besides that the one would also work, because it is such an incredible novel about the women. The funny thing with it is, the biggest to the neck is really how I always imagine my own aunt to be. I have two of them. The older one especially reminded me of her. And
Thank you so much for sharing my love for Little Woman. All the transcriptions of the Little Woman podcast are now available as paperbacks, ebooks, and as audiobooks on Amazon, Kindle, Nook, and bookstores. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
that is really thorough. It's in every novel of her. And then there are people who claim that she didn't love him. But the fact is okay, if she only included Henry David Thoreau kind of character in, for example, Little Women, then maybe we could say, okay, she didn't love him. But it is clear that she was very much in love with him or had a crush on him, because that kind of character is in all of her novels. Meg, David. I wouldn't say Tom in An Old-Fashioned Girl is completely like him, but when he matures, he also kind of becomes that kind of archetype. And I think it is really important.
Adam in Moods is also based on Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah, right. I really forgot him.
And then there's the German man in the Queen of Hearts. He's based on Henry David Thoreau. So the list goes on and on. At some point, maybe in this podcast, I will go through all of these Henry David Thoreau archetypes. Yes, you are correct. He appears in literal disguises in pretty much every single Louisa May Alcott novel or short story.
Yes, and also in A Fade to Long Love Chase, I think that's what it's called. It's quite a school. And I think that one is also very important, because in that one, Henry David Thoreau is kind of his archetype characters. I think Father Ignatius. I don't know, I can't remember his name, but I think that was his name. And he also kind of really reminded me of Friedrich, but I have to say, I still love Friedrich more, because I think out of all the Henry David Thoreau archetypes, I think Friedrich is the one who speaks mostly to my heart, probably because he's also, because he can talk German. I always found when he does include two German words, it has English phrases and English sentences, because I'm I can understand everything he says, and it is so cute.
Yes, and it's adorable because in Little Woman he is still trying to study English, and he speaks with a broken English, and then he throws these German words here and there. Then in Little Man, the narrator says that he has improved his English a lot, but he still uses some of his favorite German phrases like Schatz and mein Son, and yeah.
Yes, that is true. I also have to say, I think it is also very important for him to actually use this kind of, he has a very open vocabulary, I'd say. And I think it is also very important to note that he didn't come to New York for himself. The reason why he came there was to provide for his nephews. And I think it also shows his very caring nature. Thought just came now to my mind. It's also kind of a parallel to Louisa Mayalcott when she wants to provide for her own nephews. And I think that was the reason why she even started writing Little Men. She knew she wanted to write another book to the series, but she was like, okay, I have to provide for my nephews because their father just died. And then she wrote Little Men, and that is just so sweet. And it's also a wonderful parallel to how Friedrich came to Europe to provide for his nephews, and when he seeks work so he can provide a home for Joe.
That is true. I hadn't thought about that before, but that is a parallel between Louisa Mayalcott and Friedrich's character. Her brother-in-law, John Pratt, had died before she started to write Little Men.
I also have to say, whenever I read Little Men, I always cry at the passage when John Brooke dies. But again, it is such a great revelation on how caring Friedrich is, because he is very important in the novel Little Men as well. And I just love him even more for that he's so caring and so sweet. And it's kind of funny. I also wrote that to you. It's kind of, it is normally in picture, these kind of characters, the one who are very caring, who are very open about their feelings, who work for loved ones, most are actually women in these kind of fictions. And I also think it's very important that Friedrich is a male because he kind of unifies men and women in his character.
Yes, he has very empathic nature that is often considered to be more feminine.
Yes, that's true. But I think for me, I'm not in the age right now, but if there was somebody I'd like to marry or somebody I would fall in love with, that would probably be somebody who's empathetic, who loves me, who respects me. It's of such importance for a person to be empathetic because then the world can evolve with people like that.
And that was such a big deal for Louisa Mayalcott. She found it very important that people did feel sympathy to others, especially those in bad situations, because she came from such a poor background herself.
Definitely. And I also think it's very important that, unlike many fans who actually wanted Joe and Laurie to be together, I think it is perfect that she made Joe and Friedrich an official couple, because in part 1, they are the Hummels, they are German, and besides Beth, I think Joe is the one who cares for them the most. And like I said, they're German, they are poor, and that is the same how Friedrich is. He's German, he's poor, and I think it is also very important that she showed that interracial relationships are important, and that they are just marriages between couples that are the same race.
I think still today you can get some backlash if you are dating someone who is not from the same culture than you are, but in those times it was even more scandalous. And then we have Amy and Laurie is half Italian, and Italians were not treated with respect in the 19th century America.
I think his Italian side only shows when he has one of his roots, when he's angry, or when he's happy, or something like that. Only then do we see that he is Italian. That's not to be a stereotype. But I think it's that people who are from that kind of country, they are very temperamental.
There are some scenes in Little Woman where Laurie mentions how he wants to connect more with his Italian roots, and that I think that's why he's also very artistic. He's interested in music and art and things like that, and to him Italy sort of represents those things. And then I think it has a parallel to Joe, because for Joe, Germany and Goethe and German Romanticism, it really represents sort of high literature, high poetry, theater pieces, and all these great things that come from Germany. So not only is Louisa Mayalcott a Germanophile, but Joe is also a Germanophile.
Yes, that is very much true. And I also have to say I love it that both Joe and Louisa Mayalcott are very interested in German culture and German language and costumes. I know it came much later, but when you think of World War II, especially, like, for me, it is also very important that a novel at that time portrayed the German culture, German language, etc. as a very good and new thing. Because mostly when I now look at movies or something like that, it is mostly propagandic that all Germans are bad. And I think that is a very sad thing because, I mean, everybody has a good and a bad side inside him or herself. And I think it should be balanced. And I really love that, unlike most people of her time, Louisa Mayalcott didn't treat German people with disrespect, but with very much respect, especially because she was a transcendentalist, and transcendentalism is because, first of all, his language is very wonderful for me. And I also have to say, I have a fable for interesting people, so I guess I'll someday even read all of Goethe's novels, or when I find a good biography, I'll also plan on reading one, because I also think that it's very important to know about people who shaped our culture.
What you said about Schiller made me wonder if Schiller was the one who Friedrich was named after in Little Woman, or maybe it was Friedrich Dalmat for Gay. But I have a feeling it might have been Schiller.
Yeah, me too. Especially because I think that Goethe and Schiller, they are very close. Like I said, he wrote a poem after seeing a skull. I think because they were very good friends, and Louisa Mayalcott was such, not a fanatic, but she really, really loved Goethe. That was very clear. I mean, even in work, David, he has novels of Schiller as well as of Goethe. So I think it is more likely that Friedrich is named after Schiller. Yes, that's of course my own theory. But like I said, I also think that besides Goethe, I think Schiller also may have had an impact on Louisa, because in The Robbers, I think it's called, in Schiller's first novel, there's a feminine character called Amalia. I don't know how to pronounce her in English, but she is very sweet, very generous. She is like kind of like Beth, but without the fact that Beth fell in love with somebody. She's very kind and giving and generous, and she only wants the best for everyone. So I also had some parallels between Schiller's work and Louisa's work.
That's really interesting. What was the name of that book?
It was called The Robbers. Like I said, it's the first novel, so I haven't read anything else to him yet. But maybe in another novel of this, we also see how much he's in, because we wrote there the one when he was 17. Suppose he was not allowed to write at that time. I forgot why, but he wasn't allowed. And I think it's funny that he made a story that is close to Louisa Mayalcott's Blood and Thunder stories, and the main character, Cole, is very much an archetype of the movement that was around in Germany at that time.
I was just saying that in Rose in Blue, Mac reads Goethe, but I realized he doesn't read Goethe, he actually reads Henry David Thoreau. In Little Woman, there's a moment in part 1 where John translates a poem from Schiller to Meg.
Yes, that is very cute, and it's also very funny because John also knows German, and it's also funny if you think about it. It's kind of like the whole March family is very interested in German culture. Like, maybe you don't see much with the others as much as you see with Joe, but I think Meg was also very eager to hear the translation of it, and John was also like, yeah, I'll help you translate it, or I can teach you with German. I think he said that. I'm not sure, but I think he said that. And it was also very sweet.
Yes, I have forgotten about that. I love it. It kind of goes along with my theory that Louisa Mayalcott planned Joe's marriage maybe years before she wrote Little Woman, because it does feel like a natural thing to do, to introduce a German character to this family that is really obsessed about everything that comes from Germany.
I have to say, the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear like people saying Friedrich was on a shovel because Louisa was forced to marry Joe off is, well, but why, if she was forced, why in the world would Louisa Mayalcott write so many things about Joe's and the wife's rough for Germany.
I think we can all agree that this really comes from that the quote that she wrote in her journal was about reuniting with her loved one in the afterlife. So Little Woman is a wish fulfillment.
Yes, that's true. And I also have to say, when people read it, I think it's also kind of racist of them to state that he was followed into the novel, because they know Friedrich is German, and it's almost always he's they dislike him, especially because he is German. Even people today are meh, she should have stayed single. Or
when Amy's limes are thrown to the snow, they are the Irish girls who are picking on her. We don't know.
But it's also kind of funny because Hannah herself is Irish, and Hannah is portrayed in a good light. So I agree with you. I think it is more like the effects of the time, because if Louisa Mayalcott included a Chinese and Asian character in one of the novels, had this person marry an American, and it was portrayed as a good thing, then why should she be completely against the Irish if Hannah was portrayed in such a good light?
I think it's a bit the same, now there's war going on in Ukraine, and Finnish here are boycotting Russian products. But I don't think all Finnish hate Russians because of that. It's not all Russians who are there or who are the cause of the situation, but it's certain individuals. I think we are onto something here. And the Marches themselves are Irish descendants, so I think it's a lot more complex. I think it's the same with the Italians, because on one hand, we have Louisa Mayalcott, who really sort of shows what she considered good qualities of Italians and maybe the less good qualities. But there was lots of hate against Italians at the time period. So it's quite remarkable that Laurie is half Italian in the book. And Germans were also really disliked during this time period in America in certain circles.
I also think it's very important, Mr. Lawrence is actually portrayed he's a very kind and giving and lovable person, but he also is a flaw that part one we learned that his son-in-law or married an Italian woman, and she was against it. Mrs. March states that he never could like the Italian lady, even though she was very kind and loving and overall a very nice person, and Mr. Lawrence couldn't like her, even though she was very kind to him and all that stuff, simply because he kind of represented, I think, the culture or the society around that time.
If Mr. Lawrence was raised in an environment where there is a lot of preconceptions against Italians, then he would part of that kind of generation that sort of automatically sees them as lower than he. It sucks, but that's the way a lot of people are, even still today.
Yes, sadly. But I also have to say, I really love how Louisa Mayalcott, she made these interracial marriages and that women work so well. Whenever I read those passages between the couples, except for Meg and John, they are both American. They're still a lovely couple, though. But whenever I read it, I love the way Louisa Mayalcott portrays these couples, Amy and Laurie, and Joe and Friedrich, because it really gets lost in all of the adaptations. I think the only couple which gets a bit of light, where we get to see a bit, it is the one between John and Meg, only because Meg is the first one to marry, I assume. But then movie makers all romanticize Joe and Laurie, and it doesn't feel right, because it also kind of cheapens the fact that does in the end fall in love with Friedrich and never in love with Laurie the way people expected her to.
Because that's not the way things happen in the novel. And because Laurie is based partially on Laddie Wisniewski. And the more I have read about Louisa Mayalcott's relationship with Laddie Wisniewski, it more and more feels like as a mother and son relationship.
I see what you mean. I also have to state that for me, I don't think that Little Women would have been, I will call it perfect, because nothing or nobody is perfect, but it would have not been the masterpiece, as I call it, if Joe had ended up with Laurie, because first of all, Louisa Mayalcott based all the characters around somebody she loved, cared about with you. And it would not have been right for her to marry Joe and Laurie because Ladislav is the inspiration for Laurie, one of the inspirations, and she doesn't